My name is Evelyn Caldwell. I am 35 years old. For 18 years, I abandoned my own career to build the life my husband wanted. I gave up my master's degree, worked 3 exhausting jobs, and became the unpaid chief financial officer of his luxury landscaping business. I thought we were a team building an empire together. Then on a completely normal Tuesday, our housekeeper of 10 years grabbed my wrist in the driveway, her eyes wide with terror, and whispered a warning that would change my reality forever. She begged me not to go inside my own home. I ignored her warning. I walked through my own front door and I found the secret my husband had been hiding inside our marriage. Before I tell you exactly what I found on his unlocked laptop and how I took back every single penny he tried to steal from me, please take a moment to like this video and subscribe to the channel. If you believe that financial abuse is just as real as any other kind of betrayal, drop a comment and let me know what city and state you are watching from and what time it is right now. Now let me take you back to the afternoon that broke my life into 2 pieces. It was a Tuesday in early October. The air in our upscale suburban neighborhood had just turned crisp, and the leaves were starting to shift into shades of gold and amber. I had spent the entire morning running errands for Richard's company Caldwell Luxury Landscapes. I had dropped off payroll at the local bank, picked up a custom part for one of the commercial mowers from a supplier 2 towns over, and finalized the quarterly tax extensions that Richard had told me were absolutely critical to sign this week. That was my life. I was the invisible engine running his machine. When we first met, I was a brilliant financial analyst candidate. I had a full ride to a prestigious graduate program. Richard was a charming, ambitious guy with a single rusty pickup truck and a lawnmower full of massive dreams, but absolutely no idea how to execute them. I loved him, so I willingly put my own dreams on a high shelf. I worked night shifts as a waitress and day shifts as a bank teller to pay for his first commercial equipment. I built his entire accounting system from scratch. I spent my 20s living on budget meals and wearing clearance rack clothes so he could buy the custom branded trucks and the sharp tailored suits he needed to meet with high-end clients. He always told me we were doing this for our future. He would kiss my forehead after a long night of me balancing his business ledgers and tell me I was his secret weapon. I believed him completely. I pulled my 10-year-old sedan into our long, winding driveway, parking behind his brand-new customized heavy-duty truck. I grabbed my purse and the thick stack of mail from the passenger seat. I was exhausted. My head was pounding with a dull ache, and I just wanted to make a cup of chamomile tea and sit in silence for 20 minutes. But as I walked toward the side door of the house, Beverly intercepted me. Beverly had been our housekeeper for 10 years. She was a warm, no-nonsense woman in her late 50s who practically felt like family. She knew my habits, she knew my schedule, and she was always cheerful. But that afternoon, she did not look like herself at all. She was standing by the side gate, clutching a feather duster so tightly her knuckles were completely white. Her face was drained of all color, leaving her looking pale and sickly. When I got closer, she stepped directly into my path, physically blocking me from reaching the door. She reached out and grabbed my wrist. Her grip was surprisingly strong and her hand was trembling violently. "Beverly," I asked, completely confused, "what is wrong? Are you all right?" She looked over her shoulder toward the house, her eyes wide and frantic, darting around as if she expected someone to jump out at us. "Miss Evelyn," she whispered, her voice barely a breath, rough with panic, "please do not go home. Do not go inside right now. Just turn around and leave. Go back to your car." I stared at her. The cold October wind suddenly felt freezing against my skin. "What are you talking about?" I asked, my voice rising slightly. "Is someone in there? Is Richard okay? Did something happen? He is in his office," Beverly whispered, tugging on my wrist to pull me further away from the windows. I was cleaning the hallway. I heard him talking on the phone. "Miss Evelyn, he's doing something terrible. You should not go in. Just get back in your car and drive away for a while." My heart started to pound heavily against my ribs, a slow, dreadful thud that echoed in my ears. A rational person might have listened to her. A rational person might have walked away and waited at a coffee shop until whatever was happening blew over. But I had spent 18 years building that house, paying for that house, and securing the perfect life inside it. I was not going to run away from my own home like a frightened guest. I gently let go of Beverly's trembling hand. I told her to go home early, that I would still pay her for the full day, and that she should take the rest of the afternoon off. She looked at me with deep sorrow, shook her head once, and hurried toward her car. I took a deep breath, turned the brass knob, and pushed the side door open. The house was perfectly quiet. It smelled like lemon polish, and the fresh lilies I had arranged on the kitchen island 2 days ago. Everything looked exactly the way it always did. The gleaming hardwood floors, the expensive artwork on the walls, the illusion of a perfect, successful American marriage. But as I walked softly down the hallway toward Richard's home office, taking care not to let my heels click against the wood, I heard his voice. The heavy mahogany door of his office was cracked open just an inch. I stopped breathing. I pressed my back flat against the hallway wall just outside his office and listened. He was not talking in his usual booming, confident business voice that he used with clients. He was speaking in a low, excited, almost breathless tone. And peering through the narrow crack in the door, I could see his reflection in the large wall mirror opposite his desk. He was not holding his expensive smartphone. He was holding a cheap, disposable prepaid phone to his ear. A burner phone. He was talking to his sister Sarah. Sarah had always treated me with a sort of smug, condescending tolerance, but I never truly understood why she looked at me like I was a joke. Now, listening to her brother, I was about to find out. "Yes, Sarah. Everything is lined up perfectly," Richard was saying, letting out a short, arrogant laugh that made my stomach turn. "I just need her to sign those routine tax extensions tomorrow morning. She signs whatever I put in front of her. She trusts me completely. She never questions the forms." He paced across the room, disappearing from the mirror and then reappearing. "The moment she signs those papers, the final transfer is fully authorized. I will move the money by tomorrow afternoon before the banks close for the weekend." I felt a cold, hard knot form in my stomach. What transfer? I managed the books for his company. I knew every single cent that went in and out of Caldwell Luxury Landscapes. I reconciled the accounts every Friday. There was no final transfer scheduled for anything. Then Richard laughed again. It was a cruel, dismissive sound that I had never heard him direct at me in 18 years. I know he said to his sister, his voice dripping with amusement. "It is hilarious. She still thinks the house is fully paid off. She thinks she owns it free and clear." My entire body went numb. I could not feel my fingers or my toes. The house. We had paid off our mortgage 3 years ago. It had been the proudest moment of my entire life. I had taken on extra consulting clients just to make double payments for 5 years. When the bank sent the final letter, I had thrown a celebration party in our backyard. I had framed the final statement and hung it in my personal filing cabinet. We owned the house, which was currently valued at well over $1 million in this highly sought-after neighborhood. What did he mean? She still thinks the house is paid off. Richard continued talking, oblivious to his wife standing mere inches away listening to her life shatter. "Todd has everything ready at the warehouse," he said, mentioning his brother. "Once the money hits the offshore account for Creek Holdings, I am filing for bankruptcy on the landscaping business. Evelyn will be left holding the bag for all the corporate debt. I will be in Aspen by Monday, and she will be out on the street. It is flawless." I pressed both of my hands firmly over my mouth to stop the violent gasp that was fighting its way out of my throat. My husband, the man I had given my entire youth to, the man whose empire I had built with my own unpaid labor, was planning to leave me homeless and bankrupt by the end of the weekend. Aspen. Why Aspen? We did not own a property in Aspen. We did not have an offshore company called Creek Holdings. I heard his leather desk chair squeak loudly as he stood up. "I need to run to the commercial site and check on the crew," he told Sarah through the burner phone. "I will call you from the car on my regular phone." Panic flooded my system. I quickly backed away from the office door. my heart hammering wildly, and slipped silently into the downstairs powder room. I pulled the door shut until it clicked softly, plunging myself into darkness. A moment later, I heard Richard walk out of his office and down the hall. I heard the familiar jingle of his heavy keyring. I heard the front door open and shut with a solid thud. I heard the massive engine of his custom truck roar to life and back out of the gravel driveway. I stood in the dark bathroom for a full minute, shaking so violently that my teeth were chattering together. The betrayal was so massive, so structurally incomprehensible, that my brain could barely process the words I had just heard. But I did not collapse onto the floor. I did not burst into tears. The naive, devoted wife in me died right there on those expensive bathroom tiles. In her place, the seasoned financial analyst woke up, cold, calculating, and absolutely desperate for the truth. I stepped out of the bathroom and walked straight into his office. The room was pristine. His massive mahogany desk, the one I had bought him for our 5th wedding anniversary with my own saved money, was perfectly organized. And sitting right in the middle of it was his laptop. It was open, and because he had just stepped away in a hurry, it was unlocked. The screen was bright and waiting. I sat down in his leather chair. My hands hovered over the keyboard. For 18 years, I had respected his privacy to a fault. I had never looked at his personal emails, his private text messages, or his hidden files. I trusted him with my life. But those days of blind faith were permanently over. I grabbed the computer mouse. I minimized his landscape design software that was currently filling the screen. On the desktop, hiding in plain sight among dozens of mundane business folders, was a subfolder titled simply Project Aspen. I double-clicked it. The folder contained dozens of digital PDF documents. I opened the first one. It was a real estate property listing for a $3 million luxury penthouse in Aspen, Colorado. The status at the top of the page was listed as pending sale. I opened the next document. It was a wire transfer authorization form linked to an LLC named Creek Holdings, but it was the third document that made my blood run absolutely cold. It was a legal loan agreement, specifically a home equity line of credit known as a HELOC, issued by a private aggressive offshore lending firm that did not ask too many questions. The loan amount was for $850,000. It was secured directly against our house. The house I had spent a decade bleeding myself dry to pay off. I scrolled frantically down to the signature page. There was Richard's signature, bold and sloppy as it always was. And right below it on the line designated for the legal co-owner of the property was my name, Evelyn Caldwell. But I had never signed this document in my life. I had never even seen it. I stared closely at the screen, my eyes tracing the loops and curves of the letters. It was a perfect, flawless forgery. He had practiced my handwriting until he could replicate it beautifully. He had taken out a massive secret loan against our home, effectively stripping away all the equity we had built and transferring the cash into a holding account I could not access. If he took that money, transferred it offshore to buy the penthouse, and then deliberately defaulted on this fraudulent loan while declaring bankruptcy, the private lenders would immediately foreclose and seize my home. I would be legally and financially responsible for an $850,000 debt because the bank believed my signature was on the contract. He was going to take the cash, buy a luxury life in the mountains, and leave me completely and utterly ruined. I sat there paralyzed, staring at the digital evidence of my own destruction. Every long night working overtime, every missed vacation, every cheap meal. All of it was just a staging ground for his elaborate, horrific theft. I felt a wave of intense nausea wash over me. I needed to copy these files immediately. I needed to send them to my own secure server before he could hide them again. I reached blindly into my purse to find my phone. But before my trembling fingers could close around it, I heard a sound that made my blood freeze solid in my veins. The heavy, unmistakable crunch of tires on the gravel in the driveway. The roar of the custom truck engine returning. He had come back. A car door slammed shut. Heavy work boots marched up the front steps. The key turned violently in the front door lock. I was sitting directly at his desk. The laptop was wide open. The forged fraudulent loan document was blazing brightly on the screen for anyone to see. The front door swung open. Evelyn, his voice called out, echoing sharply down the hardwood hallway. "Are you home?" His heavy boots thumped against the floorboards, walking directly and purposefully toward the office. I had exactly 5 seconds before my husband walked through that door and saw me staring at his $1,000,000 secret. "Evelyn, are you home?" His voice echoed sharply down the hardwood hallway. I had exactly 5 seconds before my husband walked through the office door and saw me staring at the fraudulent loan documents that would destroy my life. My brain immediately bypassed the shock and shifted into pure cold survival mode. My fingers flew across the computer mouse. I clicked the small red cross in the top corner of the screen. The forged contract vanished. I rapidly closed the subfolder titled Project Aspen. I clicked on the landscape design software that he had left open earlier in the day, expanding the green grids and plant layouts to fill the entire monitor. Then I pushed my heavy leather chair back, grabbed my purse from the desk, and deliberately knocked a full ceramic cup of pens and paper clips onto the floor. The ceramic shattered. The pens scattered across the polished wood with a loud clatter just as Richard turned the corner and stepped into the doorway. "There you are," he said. I was on my hands and knees on the floor, frantically sweeping the broken ceramic pieces and metal clips into a small pile. I forced my breathing to slow down. I made myself look up at him and offer an embarrassed smile. "I am so clumsy today," I said, keeping my voice remarkably steady. "I came in to put the afternoon mail on your desk and my purse caught the edge of the cup." Richard leaned casually against the doorframe. He was wearing his tailored charcoal suit, the expensive one he always wore when he met with high-net-worth clients or bank managers. He looked handsome, relaxed, and completely unbothered. He looked exactly like the man I had loved and trusted for 18 years, not a monster who was actively plotting to leave me bankrupt and homeless. "Do not worry about it," he said, stepping over a stray pen. "Just leave the mess for Beverly to clean up tomorrow. Are you feeling any better? You said you were coming down with a fever earlier." "I am just tired," I replied, standing up and brushing off my knees. "I am going to start making dinner." I walked past him. I was close enough to smell his expensive cologne. It took every ounce of physical restraint in my body, not to scream, not to grab him by the lapels of his suit and demand to know why he was doing this to me. But the financial analyst inside me knew better. If I confronted him now without a plan, without securing my assets, he would deny everything, execute the wire transfer, and vanish. I had to play the part of the blind, devoted wife for just a little while longer. I went into the kitchen and began preparing dinner. Cooking had always been my way of unwinding after a long day of managing his company ledgers, but tonight, peeling potatoes and chopping vegetables felt like an out-of-body experience. I watched the sharp steel blade of the chef knife slice cleanly through the carrots. My mind was racing at 1,000,000 miles an hour. $850,000. He had forged my signature to strip $850,000 of equity out of the home I had paid for. Richard walked into the kitchen, loosened his silk tie, and poured himself a large glass of expensive red wine. He leaned against the granite counter, completely at ease in the beautiful kitchen that my sweat and tears had funded. "Busy day out there today?" he asked casually, taking a slow sip of his wine. "Just running your errands," I replied, keeping my back to him as I stirred the simmering pot on the stove. I dropped off the commercial payroll at the bank. I picked up the custom parts for the new mowers. I felt a cold bead of sweat roll slowly down my spine. I was waiting for him to bring up the papers, the documents he needed me to sign. He did not mention them right away. Instead, he started talking about his day. He complained about a wealthy client who was delaying a final payment on a massive garden installation. He talked about how incredibly hard he worked to keep Caldwell Luxury Landscapes afloat, how much pressure he was under as the sole provider, how exhausting it was to carry the weight of our lifestyle on his shoulders. I stood perfectly still listening to him complain, and a deep toxic bitterness flooded my veins. How hard he worked, how much he carried. When we were in our 20s, I was the one working 3 jobs, so he could pretend to be a businessman. I remembered the thick smell of stale grease at the cheap diner where I waited tables until 2 in the morning serving drunk college students just to make rent. I remembered coming home my feet swollen and aching inside cheap shoes, only to wake up 4 hours later for my morning shift as a bank teller. I had a full-ride scholarship to a prestigious master program in finance. It was my ticket to an incredible career. But I walked away from it because Richard needed $30,000 in seed money for his first batch of commercial mowers and a reliable truck. I gave up my entire future so he could have a present. For a decade, I handled his corporate taxes, managed his payroll, audited his accounts, and balanced his books all completely for free. I was his unpaid chief financial officer. I had negotiated with his vendors. I had secured his first business credit lines using my own excellent credit score because his was ruined. I had made myself intentionally small, fading into the background so he could stand at the front of the room and feel exceptionally big. And now he was taking my past, my present, and my future, packing it all into a forged loan document and preparing to throw me out onto the street. We sat down at the dining table. The roasted chicken and vegetables looked perfect. The warm lighting cast a soft glow over the crystal glasses and the linen napkins. It was the absolute perfect illusion of a successful American marriage. Richard took a bite of his food, chewed slowly, and then wiped his mouth. By the way, he said his tone entirely too light, entirely too casual. Did you get a chance to look at those quarterly tax extensions I left for you? I really need you to sign them tonight. The accountant is breathing down my neck about the federal deadline. He reached into his thick leather briefcase sitting on the chair right next to him. He pulled out a heavy manila envelope and slid it across the polished mahogany table. It stopped directly next to my dinner plate. My heart hammered violently against my ribs. I knew exactly what was inside that envelope. It was not a routine tax extension. It was the final bank authorization to wire the stolen $850,000 into the offshore account for Creek Holdings. If I picked up a pen and signed my name on that bottom line, the money would vanish by tomorrow afternoon. The bank would approve the transfer because they believed I was a willing participant. I would be left holding a massive fraudulent debt, and he would be on his way to a luxury life with his sister and whoever else he was hiding. I have a terrible migraine, Richard, I said softly, letting my voice sound weak and strained. My vision is actually starting to blur. I feel dizzy. I absolutely cannot look at fine print right now. Let me sleep it off, and I will sign them for you first thing tomorrow morning over coffee. His jaw tightened instantly. Just for a fraction of a second, the charming patient husband mask slipped and I saw the cold, calculating panic underneath. He needed that money moved before the weekend. He needed my signature tonight. It will literally take you 2 seconds, Evelyn. He pressed his voice, losing its artificial warmth and taking on a hard, demanding edge. Just sign the back page. You do not even need to read the details. You know I handle all the financial specifics for us. I know you do, I said, forcing a weary, trusting smile. But I honestly feel sick to my stomach. I think I'm going to throw up if I try to read legal jargon right now. I am going to lie down in the dark. The papers will be signed and ready for you by 7 in the morning. I promise. I stood up from the table, leaving my dinner completely untouched, and walked away. I could feel his eyes burning into my back, analyzing my retreat, wondering if I knew, wondering if I was playing a game. But he did not push it. He could not risk making me suspicious by forcing a pen into my hand. I went into our master bedroom, changed into my pajamas, and climbed into bed. 2 hours later, Richard came into the room. He did not say a word. He stripped off his suit, turned off the overhead light, and climbed into bed beside me. I lay perfectly still in the pitch-black room for what felt like an eternity. I listened to the sound of his breathing. I waited for the slow, rhythmic exhales that meant he had fallen into a deep sleep. Lying next to him felt like lying next to a venomous snake. My skin crawled with absolute revulsion. The man I had shared a bed with for nearly 2 decades was a complete stranger. When the digital clock on the nightstand glowed 2 in the morning, I finally moved. I slid silently out from under the heavy down comforter. I did not put on my slippers. I walked barefoot across the plush carpet, stepping carefully over the floorboards I knew would creak, and slipped out of the bedroom. I went straight to the dark kitchen and opened my personal laptop. I did not need to guess Richard's passwords. Because I had built his entire digital accounting infrastructure from the ground up, I knew the master administrative codes for our shared family cloud storage and his corporate servers. I pulled my sweater tightly around my shoulders to ward off the chill and began to dig. I did not search for Project Aspen. He knew I had been in the office, and if he had any sense, he would have moved or encrypted that specific folder. Instead, I searched for the flow of money. I pulled up the corporate banking logs and looked for irregular vendor payments. I found a series of consistent high-dollar transfers categorized as premium soil and stone imports. The vendor name was listed as Creek Holdings. I cross-referenced the vendor identification numbers with the state business registry documents I kept on file. I found a scanned copy of the Articles of Incorporation for Creek Holdings. It was a domestic limited liability company registered just 3 months ago, and there listed under the primary contact information was not a commercial warehouse or a standard post office box, but a physical residential address. It was located in the most expensive, highly secured luxury condominium tower in downtown Boston. I stared at the glowing screen. Why would a shell company designed to hold stolen offshore funds have a registered address at a luxury residential building in the city? Richard did not conduct commercial landscaping business downtown. We did not own a condo. I opened a new browser window and searched the property address. The real estate listing showed a penthouse suite with floor-to-ceiling windows, custom marble countertops, and private elevator access. The monthly rent was roughly $12,000. He was not just hiding money. He was housing someone. The realization hit me like a physical blow to the chest. The burner phone, the sister laughing about my total ignorance, the desperate rush to steal our home equity before the weekend. There was a completely separate life happening inside that downtown penthouse funded entirely by the money I had bled myself dry to earn. I closed the laptop and sat alone in the dark kitchen. The panic and the terror I had felt earlier in the afternoon were completely gone. They had been replaced by a quiet, absolute rage. Richard thought I was just a slow, obedient housewife who would blindly sign her own ruin. He had forgotten that I was a brilliant financial mind who knew how to audit a trail of lies. I looked at the clock. It was 3 a.m. In exactly 4 hours, Richard would expect me to sign those fraudulent tax papers. I realized then that I could not just delay him with a fake migraine anymore. I needed to know exactly who or what was waiting inside that luxury condo before I made my next move. The morning sun felt like a violent intrusion as it filtered through the bedroom blinds. I lay perfectly still under the heavy duvet, listening to the rhythmic sound of the shower running in the master bathroom. Richard was humming. My husband of 18 years was actually humming a cheerful, upbeat melody while preparing to steal my entire life and leave me bankrupt. I dragged myself out of bed, every muscle in my body aching from the massive adrenaline crash of the previous night. I had spent hours sitting in the dark kitchen tracing his fraudulent financial web through encrypted corporate ledgers until I located the downtown luxury condominium. Now I had to walk downstairs, look the man I had trusted with my youth in the eye, and pretend I was still his foolish, compliant, invisible wife. I walked into the kitchen and forced myself to go through the mundane motions of making a pot of coffee. A few minutes later, Richard strolled into the room wearing a crisp white dress shirt, perfectly tailored charcoal trousers, and his favorite expensive watch. The watch I had purchased for his 40th birthday. He smelled of rich cedar aftershave and absolute arrogance. He dropped his leather briefcase on the granite island, placing it deliberately next to the thick manila envelope containing the forged bank transfer authorization. He tapped the thick envelope with his index finger, offering me that practiced, effortless smile that had successfully fooled me for nearly 2 decades. "Good morning, sweetheart," he said, his voice dripping with artificial warmth. "Are you feeling any better today? I really need your signature on these tax extensions before I head out to the commercial job site. The accountant called me again this morning and we are right up against the federal deadline. I stared at the expensive silver pen resting beside the envelope. I knew exactly what would happen if I picked it up. If I signed my name on that bottom line, $850,000 of my hard-earned home equity would instantly vanish into a clandestine offshore account. If I outright refused to sign it, he would know immediately that I had discovered his scheme. He would likely panic, drain our legitimate business accounts, and flee the state before I could secure any legal protection from the courts. I needed to buy myself time. I pressed the palm of my hand against my forehead, squinted heavily against the bright kitchen lights, and let out a long, ragged sigh. "My migraine is actually much worse today, Richard," I said, keeping my voice incredibly fragile and strained. "I took 2 strong pain pills an hour ago, but the entire room is still spinning out of control. I cannot even focus my eyes on the coffee maker right now, let alone read fine legal print." His jaw clenched instantly. The charming, loving husband facade vanished in a fraction of a second, replaced by a cold, calculating glare that I had never truly noticed until now. "Evelyn, this is completely ridiculous. It is a single signature on a routine document. You do not even need to read it. Just sign the bottom line right now so I can get this handled and off my desk." I leaned heavily against the kitchen counter, wrapping one arm around my stomach as if I were physically ill. "I feel incredibly nauseous," I whispered, refusing to meet his angry gaze. "I think I need to go to the urgent care clinic down the street. They can give me a strong injection for the migraine. I will take the papers with me in my purse and sign them in the waiting room once the medication kicks in and my vision clears. I promise I will drop them off directly at your office before noon." He stood there silently weighing his options. I could practically see the gears turning behind his eyes. He was desperate to move that stolen money, but physically forcing a pen into my hand would raise too many suspicions and risk blowing his entire operation. "Fine." He finally snapped, his voice sharp and laced with heavy frustration. "But I need them on my desk by noon, Evelyn. Do not make me chase you down today. I have a business to run." He grabbed his keys, snatched his coffee mug, and stormed out of the house. The heavy front door slammed shut behind him, rattling the expensive artwork on the hallway walls. The moment his truck engine roared to life and disappeared down the street, my fragile sick wife routine vanished completely into the cold morning air. I did not drive to the urgent care clinic. Instead, I marched straight into my home office closet and grabbed an empty sealed cardboard shipping box left over from a recent printer delivery. I quickly printed a fake overnight courier label using my computer and taped it securely to the top of the box. Then I grabbed my car keys, locked the house, and drove directly toward downtown Boston. The drive took exactly 45 minutes, but trapped alone with my thoughts, it felt like an agonizing lifetime. As I navigated the heavy morning traffic on the interstate, I thought about the luxury address I had uncovered in the hidden corporate ledgers. I had spent my entire adult life meticulously budgeting our household expenses. I clipped coupons every Sunday. I cooked budget meals at home while my friends dined at nice restaurants. I wore clearance rack shoes until the soles wore completely thin. I did all of this willingly, because Richard constantly reminded me how incredibly tight the landscaping business margins were, how we needed to sacrifice our present comforts to build our massive retirement nest egg. All those years of relentless penny pinching, all those canceled vacations, and he was using my unpaid labor to fund a $12,000 a month luxury penthouse for someone else. I pulled up to the address of Creek Holdings. It was not a corporate office park. It was registered to one of the most exclusive high-security residential towers in the entire city. The massive building featured a sprawling glass lobby, uniformed doorman, a private concierge desk, and highly secured elevator banks. A regular visitor would never get past the front desk without the resident personally calling down to approve their entry. But as a former corporate financial analyst, I knew exactly how these elite buildings operated during the chaotic morning rush. I parked my older sedan 2 blocks down the street, grabbed my blank cardboard box, and walked briskly through the heavy revolving doors just as a large group of wealthy residents were exiting with their expensive dogs. I marched straight past the mahogany concierge desk, holding the box high against my chest, and looking incredibly annoyed, perfectly mimicking a stressed courier running late for a critical downtown delivery. I slipped into the secure elevator bank, right behind a tall man in a tailored business suit. I held my breath and watched him scan his electronic key fob. When he stepped off on the 14th floor, I quickly reached out and pressed the button for the penthouse level before the heavy doors could close. The elevator shot upward with terrifying speed. My heart hammered against my ribs with a heavy, dreadful rhythm. The polished steel doors slid silently open, revealing a private, expansive hallway lined with custom silk wallpaper and plush, thick carpeting that absorbed the sound of my footsteps. There was only one door on this entire floor. Penthouse A. I stood before the massive dark oak door for a full minute, gathering every single ounce of professional composure I had ever possessed in my life. I was not a betrayed, weeping wife coming to scream and throw accusations at a mistress. I was a veteran auditor seeking the final piece of devastating evidence. I raised my hand and knocked firmly. 3 sharp raps against the wood. A moment later, I heard the soft padding of footsteps approaching from inside. The heavy brass deadbolt clicked open. The door swung wide. Standing before me was a young woman. She could not have been older than 25. She had long, perfectly styled blonde hair, flawless glowing skin, and was wearing a matching silk lounge set that probably cost more than my entire professional wardrobe. But what absolutely stopped the breath in my throat was not her youth or her expensive clothes. It was her stomach. She was visibly, undeniably pregnant, resting a gentle, protective hand over a pronounced baby bump that looked to be at least 6 or 7 months along. "Can I help you?" she asked. Her voice was highly annoyed, carrying that distinct privileged tone of someone who was entirely used to being served and accommodated without question. I stood there momentarily paralyzed, my eyes drifting past her shoulder into the grand foyer of the penthouse. The sheer luxury of the apartment was staggering. Massive floor-to-ceiling windows offered a sweeping, uninterrupted panoramic view of the Boston city skyline. A brilliant crystal chandelier hung above a custom marble entryway table, and right there, leaning casually against the expensive white wainscoting, was a brand-new set of custom Titleist golf clubs, tucked inside a monogrammed leather bag. I recognized them instantly. My stomach plummeted into a dark abyss. I had spent 6 miserable months saving my private freelance consulting fees to buy those exact clubs for Richard for our 10th wedding anniversary last year. When I gave them to him, he had told me he kept them securely locked in his office closet because they were simply too valuable to leave in his work truck. They were not in his office. They were sitting right here in his mistress's foyer. In that specific split second, the full devastating reality of my life collapsed around my shoulders. Everything I had done for 18 years had been a staging ground for this new family. I had paid the mortgages, filed the complicated corporate taxes, and ruthlessly negotiated the vendor contracts so this young, beautiful woman could live like absolute royalty in a downtown penthouse. I had forfeited my own chance to have children because Richard had sternly insisted we could not afford the distraction or the massive financial expense while we were building his landscaping business. Yet here he was proudly starting a brand new family with a girl who was probably still taking high school exams when I was working 3 exhausting jobs to buy his first commercial lawnmower. "Hello," the young woman snapped sharply, waving a manicured hand directly in front of my face. "Are you just going to stand there staring at my apartment, or do you actually have a delivery for me?" I blinked rapidly, forcing my focus back to her annoyed face and locking away the crushing pain in a dark vault inside my mind. "I am so incredibly sorry," I said, keeping my voice perfectly polite and professional. "I have a priority secure package for this specific address." "Are you Chloe?" "Yes, I am Chloe," she huffed, crossing her arms defensively over her chest. "And honestly, you courier people are supposed to leave all packages with the concierge downstairs in the lobby. You are absolutely not supposed to come up to the private residential floors. You completely interrupted my morning routine. I am waiting for an extremely important phone call from my fiancé." Her fiancé. The absolute audacity of the lie made me want to laugh out loud, a harsh, hysterical, broken sound that I fought desperately to swallow down into my throat. He was not her fiancé. He was my husband. I sincerely apologize for the inconvenience, miss, I replied, offering her a highly practiced customer service smile. The sender required direct visual delivery verification for security purposes. Well, just give the box to me, she complained, reaching out with a perfectly manicured hand that glittered with a massive diamond ring. My fiancé Richard is finalizing the purchase of our new luxury house out in Aspen today. The private bank is supposed to be calling me this morning to confirm the final wire transfer, and I absolutely cannot tie up my time dealing with lost delivery drivers. I do not want our baby being born in an apartment, even a nice penthouse like this one. We need to close on that mountain property by the weekend so the decorators can get started. Every single word tumbling out of her mouth was a jagged puzzle piece snapping violently into place. The fraudulent home equity loan document I found on his laptop. The perfectly forged signature mimicking my handwriting. The $850,000 he was frantically trying to steal from our home equity today. It was all going straight to the Aspen property to fund their new wealthy life together. She had absolutely no idea who I was. She probably thought Richard was a highly successful wealthy bachelor or a legally divorced businessman. She was just another naive recipient of his massive pathological lies. I looked down at her pregnant belly, then back up at her annoyed, highly entitled face. I did not feel an ounce of rage toward her in that moment. I just felt a profound, chilling, terrifying clarity. Richard was going to financially destroy me, ruin my credit, and leave me homeless just to give her the world. I smiled warmly, handed her the completely blank cardboard box, and took a deliberate step back into the hallway. I truly hope you and Richard enjoy the beautiful new house out in Aspen, I said smoothly. Have a wonderful morning, Chloe. I turned on my heel and walked briskly back toward the elevator before she could even process how a random courier knew her fiancé's name. I stepped inside the heavy steel doors and firmly pressed the lobby button. As the elevator began its rapid descent toward the ground floor, the absolute suffocating silence of the cab closed in around me. I had seen everything I needed to see. The illusion of my marriage was dead, completely and permanently severed. Suddenly, the quiet was violently shattered. My cell phone began vibrating frantically inside my leather purse. I pulled it out and looked at the glowing screen. It was Richard. He was calling me. He absolutely never called me during his morning commercial site visits, unless there was a massive catastrophic emergency. I answered the phone, bringing the device slowly and calmly to my ear. Evelyn! Where the hell are you? His voice was not just angry, it was completely frantic. It was the distinct, terrified sound of a man watching his perfectly constructed house of cards begin to violently tremble. I am sitting at the urgent care clinic, Richard, I lied, keeping my voice steady, weak, and perfectly calm. I told you I was going to get a strong shot for my migraine. No, you are not! He shouted, the sheer panic bleeding directly through the phone line and ringing in my ear. I just drove past the clinic on Main Street and your car is absolutely not in the parking lot. Where are you right now? I need you to get to a computer immediately. I watched the digital floor indicator tick downward. 10, 9, 8. Why are you screaming at me, Richard? Is something wrong with the business? The bank just called me. He practically growled, his breathing ragged, heavy, and desperate. They put a massive security hold on the corporate accounts. They said there is a severe irregularity with the vendor authorizations. Evelyn, if that money does not move offshore today, we are going to lose the biggest commercial equipment deal of the entire year. I need you to call the fraud department right this second and clear the hold. Where are you? I stepped out of the elevator into the gleaming, expansive marble lobby of the building, where his pregnant mistress was currently opening a completely empty cardboard box. I walked straight out the revolving doors and into the crisp, cold Boston air. The seasoned financial analyst inside me was fully awake, and she was absolutely ready to burn his empire to the ground. The cold morning air hit my face like a physical blow as I stepped out of the luxury condominium building and back onto the busy Boston sidewalk. My phone was still warm in my hand from Richard's frantic call. He was completely panicking because the bank had paused his fraudulent wire transfer. He thought I was sitting in a local urgent care clinic waiting for a migraine injection, entirely oblivious to the massive web of lies he had spun around me. I looked back up at the towering glass structure reflecting the morning sun. Up there in the penthouse, his pregnant mistress was currently waiting for him to finalize the purchase of a $3 million mountain house with my stolen money. I did not cry. I did not scream. A profound and chilling calm washed over my entire body, pushing the heartbreak aside and leaving only a sharp, terrifying clarity. For 18 years, I had suppressed my own brilliant financial mind to play the role of a quiet, supportive wife. I had let him believe he was the mastermind of our success. But Richard was just a landscaper with a charismatic smile and a talent for manipulation. I was the one who actually understood how money moved. I walked briskly down the street to my parked sedan. I slid into the driver's seat and gripped the steering wheel tightly until my knuckles turned white. I knew exactly where I needed to go. I merged onto the highway and headed straight toward the financial district. I was going to see Thomas Sterling. Thomas was a veteran forensic accountant and the senior partner at one of the most ruthless and respected financial auditing firms in the city. 2 decades ago, he had been my professional mentor. I was his top analyst straight out of college with a brilliant career ahead of me. I remembered the afternoon I walked into his office to hand in my resignation. He had begged me not to throw my career away to manage the books for a startup landscaping company. He warned me that sacrificing my financial independence for a man with massive dreams and absolutely no capital was a dangerous game that usually ended in ruin. I had ignored him because I believed blindly in love. Now I was driving back to his office to show him exactly how right he had been all those years ago. The drive took 20 minutes. I parked in the underground garage and took the elevator up to the 40th floor. The receptionist recognized me immediately, even though it had been years since my last visit. She took one look at my pale face, my rigid posture, and the absolute terror in my eyes, and she led me straight back to his corner office without asking a single question. Thomas was sitting behind his massive mahogany desk, analyzing a thick stack of corporate tax returns. He looked exactly the same as I remembered. Silver hair, neatly combed, sharp gray eyes, and the quiet, unyielding authority of a man who spent his entire life hunting down hidden assets and corporate fraud. He looked up when I walked through the door. He put his silver pen down slowly and studied my face. "Evelyn," he said, his voice steady and low. "You look like you are watching a building burn down." I walked over and sat down heavily in the leather chair across from him. "I am watching my entire life burn down, Thomas," I said, keeping my voice perfectly level. "And I need you to help me catch the arsonist before he gets away with the insurance money." I told him everything. I did not shed a single tear while I spoke. I laid out the facts with the cold, clinical precision of a veteran auditor presenting a devastating case file. I told him about the burner phone, the secret conversation with his sister Sarah, and the forged home equity line of credit for $850,000. I explained how Richard had perfectly replicated my signature to drain the equity from the house I had paid off with my own sweat and unpaid labor. I described the downtown luxury penthouse, the pregnant 20-something mistress named Chloe, and the pending sale of a multi-million-dollar property in Aspen, Colorado. Thomas listened in absolute silence. His face hardened into a mask of pure concentration with every detail I shared. He did not offer empty sympathy or useless pity. He understood immediately that we were far beyond the point of emotional comfort. When I finally finished speaking, he stood up, walked across the room, and locked his heavy office door. Then he returned to his desk, turned his large dual computer monitors toward me, and handed me a wireless keyboard. "Show me the money, Evelyn," he said softly. "Let us see exactly how careless your husband really is." I rested my fingers on the keys and logged directly into the Caldwell Luxury Landscapes secure corporate servers. Because I had built the entire accounting infrastructure from the ground up a decade ago, I still possessed the master administrative privileges that Richard lacked the technical skills to revoke or even fully understand. I bypassed the standard security firewalls and opened the raw financial ledgers. Thomas pulled his chair up closely beside mine, and we went to work. It was like stepping back into a former life, but this time, I was investigating my own execution. For the next 3 hours, we tore Richard's financial history apart line by line. We cross-referenced the company expense reports with the corporate banking statements. The pattern of deception was staggering, but it was also incredibly sloppy. Richard had assumed that because I loved and trusted him, I would never actually audit the specific vendor payout files he submitted each month. Thomas pointed to a series of recurring high-dollar monthly payments listed under heavy machinery maintenance and premium soil imports. The vendor receiving the funds was an entity called Creek Holdings. That is the shell company registered to the downtown penthouse I told him, keeping my eyes locked on the glowing screen. He is funneling company revenue through fake invoices to pay the $12,000 monthly rent for her luxury apartment. Thomas leaned forward and started tapping his pen rhythmically against the desk. "It is much worse than that, Evelyn," he said, his voice dropping to a serious, hushed whisper. "Look at the federal tax identification numbers attached to these invoices. Richard is deducting these penthouse payments as legitimate business expenses on his corporate tax returns. He is not just stealing your marital assets to fund his secret life. He is actively committing massive federal corporate tax evasion. And because you are legally married and file joint returns, he is directly exposing you to severe federal liability. If the IRS audits this company, they will look at you as the former bookkeeper and assume you were complicit in the fraud." My stomach twisted into a tight, cold knot. The betrayal was no longer just personal. It was intensely legal and highly dangerous. I scrolled further down the ledger and opened the pending transactions folder. There it was. The fraudulent home equity loan for $850,000 was sitting in a temporary holding account. The bank had flagged it for a routine security review because the transfer destination was an offshore holding account linked to the Aspen property purchase. That was exactly why Richard was panicking on the phone this morning. The bank wanted my verbal authorization or a signed tax addendum to release the security freeze. "He is washing the stolen money," Thomas explained, tracing the digital path across the monitor with his index finger. "He pulls the cash out of your house using the forged signature on the loan documents. He routes it through the landscaping business as a fake vendor payment to Creek Holdings. Then he wires it offshore to a private trust to buy the Aspen house free and clear. Once the money crosses international lines into that private trust, it vanishes completely. It becomes utterly untraceable and untouchable by domestic family courts. If he completes this final wire transfer tomorrow afternoon, before the banks close for the weekend, you will never see a single penny of that equity again. And the predatory private lenders who issued the home equity loan will immediately foreclose on your house to collect their massive debt. You will be left bankrupt, homeless, and potentially facing federal prison for his fake business expenses." I felt a crushing, suffocating weight press down on my chest. The sheer scale of his calculated cruelty was paralyzing. He had planned this elaborate destruction for months. He had smiled at me over dinner, kissed me goodnight, and slept peacefully beside me while systematically constructing my total financial ruin. "What do we do?" I asked, my voice remaining remarkably steady, despite the absolute terror gripping my heart. "How do I stop the wire transfer without tipping him off? If I refuse to sign his fake tax papers tonight, he will know I discovered the truth. He will panic drain the legitimate operating accounts and flee the state before I can get a judge to intervene." Thomas leaned back in his heavy leather chair and steepled his fingers together. "We have to file an ex parte emergency motion for a hard asset freeze and a temporary restraining order," he said, his tone turning sharp and strategic. "We have to blindside him legally and freeze every single account attached to his name before he can execute the wire. But a federal judge will not sign an emergency order of this magnitude based solely on digital screenshots that could easily be manipulated or explained away as accounting errors. Digital files are simply not enough to freeze $850,000 without a formal hearing. We need the original physical evidence. We need the actual forged loan documents with the wet ink signatures. We need the physical fake vendor receipts that prove beyond a shadow of a doubt that he is committing federal wire fraud and tax evasion." I closed my eyes and let out a long, trembling breath. I knew exactly where Richard kept those specific physical documents. He did not keep them at the house in his home office. He was entirely too paranoid for that. He kept a massive heavy-duty, fireproof safe hidden in the back office of the Caldwell Luxury Landscapes main commercial warehouse. I had personally bought that safe for him 5 years ago to store cash deposits and original high-value client contracts. The physical ledger, the forged loan papers, and the fake printed invoices would all be locked securely inside that heavy steel box. "They are at the warehouse," I told Thomas, opening my eyes and meeting his intense, calculating gaze. "He keeps the physical books locked in a safe at the main equipment facility on the edge of town. I know the combination because he is far too lazy to change it from his college graduation year." Thomas nodded slowly, a glimmer of predatory satisfaction in his gray eyes. "Good," he said. "We need those documents in my hands by tomorrow morning so I can take them directly to a federal judge and the most ruthless forensic divorce attorney in Boston. If you can get the original files tonight, we can drop the legal hammer on him before the banks close tomorrow afternoon. It is the absolute only way to trap him before the stolen money moves offshore forever." I looked at the digital clock on the computer monitor. It was early afternoon. I had to go back to the house, play the role of the sick, obedient wife, and wait for the sun to go down. I had to break into my own company warehouse in the middle of the night to steal back my own life. But as the adrenaline began to surge through my veins, a massive, dangerous complication materialized in my mind. The commercial warehouse was not just an empty storage facility. It was a sprawling, fenced compound filled with millions of dollars worth of heavy landscaping machinery trucks and raw materials. Because the equipment was so incredibly valuable, Richard had insisted on having full-time on-site security. He had given that job to his older brother, Todd. Todd was a bitter, aggressive man who deeply resented my presence in the business and who had always actively enabled Richard's worst behaviors. Todd lived in a retrofitted modular trailer positioned directly next to the main office doors. He had 2 large, highly aggressive guard dogs that roamed the perimeter of the fenced lot every single night. His bedroom window looked directly out over the warehouse entrance. If I drove my car onto the gravel property, the dogs would bark. If the dogs barked, Todd would immediately wake up. And if Todd caught me sneaking into the back office at 2 a.m, he would instantly call Richard, and the entire operation would blow up in my face, resulting in my total destruction. I sat in the quiet luxury of Thomas Sterling's office and stared blindly at the glowing computer screen. The financial trap my husband had built was perfectly designed to destroy me without leaving a trace. The digital countdown was ticking rapidly toward my absolute ruin. I had less than 24 hours to secure the physical evidence that would save me from homelessness and federal charges. I thanked Thomas for his unwavering help and promised him I would have the physical documents on his desk by dawn. I walked out of the towering office building and stepped back into the cold, fading Boston afternoon. The seasoned financial analyst had successfully mapped the fraudulent web. Now the betrayed, desperate wife had to figure out how to bypass 2 violent guard dogs, a locked compound, and a hostile brother-in-law under the cover of absolute darkness. The cold morning air hit my face like a physical blow as I stepped out of the luxury condominium building and back onto the busy Boston sidewalk. My phone was still warm in my hand from Richard's frantic call. He was completely panicking because the bank had paused his fraudulent wire transfer. He thought I was sitting in a local urgent care clinic, waiting for a migraine injection, entirely oblivious to the massive web of lies he had spun around me. I looked back up at the towering glass structure reflecting the morning sun. Up there in the penthouse, his pregnant mistress was currently waiting for him to finalize the purchase of a $3 million mountain house with my stolen money. I did not cry. I did not scream. A profound and chilling calm washed over my entire body, pushing the heartbreak aside and leaving only a sharp, terrifying clarity. For 18 years, I had suppressed my own brilliant financial mind to play the role of a quiet, supportive wife. I had let him believe he was the mastermind of our success. But Richard was just a landscaper with a charismatic smile and a talent for manipulation. I was the one who actually understood how money moved. I walked briskly down the street to my parked sedan. I slid into the driver's seat and gripped the steering wheel tightly until my knuckles turned white. I knew exactly where I needed to go. I merged onto the highway and headed straight toward the financial district. I was going to see Thomas Sterling. Thomas was a veteran forensic accountant and the senior partner at one of the most ruthless and respected financial auditing firms in the city. 2 decades ago, he had been my professional mentor. I was his top analyst straight out of college with a brilliant career ahead of me. I remembered the afternoon I walked into his office to hand in my resignation. He had begged me not to throw my career away to manage the books for a startup landscaping company. He warned me that sacrificing my financial independence for a man with massive dreams and absolutely no capital was a dangerous game that usually ended in ruin. I had ignored him because I believed blindly in love. Now I was driving back to his office to show him exactly how right he had been all those years ago. The drive took 20 minutes. I parked in the underground garage and took the elevator up to the 40th floor. The receptionist recognized me immediately, even though it had been years since my last visit. She took one look at my pale face, my rigid posture, and the absolute terror in my eyes, and she led me straight back to his corner office without asking a single question. Thomas was sitting behind his massive mahogany desk, analyzing a thick stack of corporate tax returns. He looked exactly the same as I remembered. Silver hair, neatly combed, sharp gray eyes, and the quiet, unyielding authority of a man who spent his entire life hunting down hidden assets and corporate fraud. He looked up when I walked through the door. He put his silver pen down slowly and studied my face. "Evelyn," he said, his voice steady and low, "you look like you are watching a building burn down." I walked over and sat down heavily in the leather chair across from him. "I am watching my entire life burn down, Thomas," I said, keeping my voice perfectly level. "And I need you to help me catch the arsonist before he gets away with the insurance money." I told him everything. I did not shed a single tear while I spoke. I laid out the facts with the cold, clinical precision of a veteran auditor presenting a devastating case file. I told him about the burner phone, the secret conversation with his sister Sarah, and the forged home equity line of credit for $850,000. I explained how Richard had perfectly replicated my signature to drain the equity from the house I had paid off with my own sweat and unpaid labor. I described the downtown luxury penthouse, the pregnant 20-something mistress named Chloe, and the pending sale of a multi-million-dollar property in Aspen, Colorado. Thomas listened in absolute silence. His face hardened into a mask of pure concentration with every detail I shared. He did not offer empty sympathy or useless pity. He understood immediately that we were far beyond the point of emotional comfort. When I finally finished speaking, he stood up, walked across the room, and locked his heavy office door. Then he returned to his desk, turned his large dual computer monitors toward me, and handed me a wireless keyboard. "Show me the money, Evelyn," he said softly. "Let us see exactly how careless your husband really is." I rested my fingers on the keys and logged directly into the Caldwell Luxury Landscape's secure corporate servers. Because I had built the entire accounting infrastructure from the ground up a decade ago, I still possessed the master administrative privileges that Richard lacked the technical skills to revoke or even fully understand. I bypassed the standard security firewalls and opened the raw financial ledgers. Thomas pulled his chair up closely beside mine, and we went to work. It was like stepping back into a former life, but this time, I was investigating my own execution. For the next 3 hours, we tore Richard's financial history apart line by line. We cross-referenced the company expense reports with the corporate banking statements. The pattern of deception was staggering, but it was also incredibly sloppy. Richard had assumed that because I loved and trusted him, I would never actually audit the specific vendor payout files he submitted each month. Thomas pointed to a series of recurring high-dollar monthly payments listed under heavy machinery maintenance and premium soil imports. The vendor receiving the funds was an entity called Creek Holdings. "That is the shell company registered to the downtown penthouse," I told him, keeping my eyes locked on the glowing screen. He is funneling company revenue through fake invoices to pay the $12,000 monthly rent for her luxury apartment. Thomas leaned forward and started tapping his pen rhythmically against the desk. It is much worse than that. Evelyn, he said, his voice dropping to a serious, hushed whisper. Look at the federal tax identification numbers attached to these invoices. Richard is deducting these penthouse payments as legitimate business expenses on his corporate tax returns. He is not just stealing your marital assets to fund his secret life. He is actively committing massive federal corporate tax evasion. And because you are legally married and file joint returns, he is directly exposing you to severe federal liability. If the IRS audits this company, they will look at you as the former bookkeeper and assume you were complicit in the fraud. My stomach twisted into a tight, cold knot. The betrayal was no longer just personal. It was intensely legal and highly dangerous. I scrolled further down the ledger and opened the pending transactions folder. There it was. The fraudulent home equity loan for $850,000 was sitting in a temporary holding account. The bank had flagged it for a routine security review because the transfer destination was an offshore holding account linked to the Aspen property purchase. That was exactly why Richard was panicking on the phone this morning. The bank wanted my verbal authorization or a signed tax addendum to release the security freeze. He is washing the stolen money, Thomas explained, tracing the digital path across the monitor with his index finger. He pulls the cash out of your house using the forged signature on the loan documents. He routes it through the landscaping business as a fake vendor payment to Creek Holdings. Then he wires it offshore to a private trust to buy the Aspen house free and clear. Once the money crosses international lines into that private trust, it vanishes completely. It becomes utterly untraceable and untouchable by domestic family courts. If he completes this final wire transfer tomorrow afternoon, before the banks close for the weekend, you will never see a single penny of that equity again. And the predatory private lenders who issued the home equity loan will immediately foreclose on your house to collect their massive debt. You will be left bankrupt, homeless, and potentially facing federal prison for his fake business expenses. I felt a crushing, suffocating weight press down on my chest. The sheer scale of his calculated cruelty was paralyzing. He had planned this elaborate destruction for months. He had smiled at me over dinner, kissed me goodnight, and slept peacefully beside me while systematically constructing my total financial ruin. What do we do? I asked, my voice remaining remarkably steady, despite the absolute terror gripping my heart. How do I stop the wire transfer without tipping him off? If I refuse to sign his fake tax papers tonight, he will know I discovered the truth. He will panic drain the legitimate operating accounts and flee the state before I can get a judge to intervene. Thomas leaned back in his heavy leather chair and steepled his fingers together. We have to file an ex parte emergency motion for a hard asset freeze and a temporary restraining order, he said, his tone turning sharp and strategic. We have to blindside him legally and freeze every single account attached to his name before he can execute the wire. But a federal judge will not sign an emergency order of this magnitude based solely on digital screenshots that could easily be manipulated or explained away as accounting errors. Digital files are simply not enough to freeze $850,000 without a formal hearing. We need the original physical evidence. We need the actual forged loan documents with the wet ink signatures. We need the physical fake vendor receipts that prove beyond a shadow of a doubt that he is committing federal wire fraud and tax evasion. I closed my eyes and let out a long, trembling breath. I knew exactly where Richard kept those specific physical documents. He did not keep them at the house in his home office. He was entirely too paranoid for that. He kept a massive heavy-duty, fireproof safe hidden in the back office of the Caldwell Luxury Landscapes main commercial warehouse. I had personally bought that safe for him 5 years ago to store cash deposits and original high-value client contracts. The physical ledger, the forged loan papers, and the fake printed invoices would all be locked securely inside that heavy steel box. They are at the warehouse, I told Thomas, opening my eyes and meeting his intense, calculating gaze. He keeps the physical books locked in a safe at the main equipment facility on the edge of town. I know the combination because he is far too lazy to change it from his college graduation year. Thomas nodded slowly, a glimmer of predatory satisfaction in his gray eyes. Good, he said. We need those documents in my hands by tomorrow morning, so I can take them directly to a federal judge and the most ruthless forensic divorce attorney in Boston. If you can get the original files tonight, we can drop the legal hammer on him before the banks close tomorrow afternoon. It is the absolute only way to trap him before the stolen money moves offshore forever. I looked at the digital clock on the computer monitor. It was early afternoon. I had to go back to the house, play the role of the sick, obedient wife, and wait for the sun to go down. I had to break into my own company warehouse in the middle of the night to steal back my own life. But as the adrenaline began to surge through my veins, a massive, dangerous complication materialized in my mind. The commercial warehouse was not just an empty storage facility. It was a sprawling, fenced compound filled with millions of dollars worth of heavy landscaping machinery trucks and raw materials. Because the equipment was so incredibly valuable, Richard had insisted on having full-time on-site security. He had given that job to his older brother, Todd. Todd was a bitter, aggressive man who deeply resented my presence in the business and who had always actively enabled Richard's worst behaviors. Todd lived in a retrofitted modular trailer positioned directly next to the main office doors. He had 2 large, highly aggressive guard dogs that roamed the perimeter of the fenced lot every single night. His bedroom window looked directly out over the warehouse entrance. If I drove my car onto the gravel property, the dogs would bark. If the dogs barked, Todd would immediately wake up. And if Todd caught me sneaking into the back office at 2 a.m, he would instantly call Richard and the entire operation would blow up in my face, resulting in my total destruction. I sat in the quiet luxury of Thomas Sterling's office and stared blindly at the glowing computer screen. The financial trap my husband had built was perfectly designed to destroy me without leaving a trace. The digital countdown was ticking rapidly toward my absolute ruin. I had less than 24 hours to secure the physical evidence that would save me from homelessness and federal charges. I thanked Thomas for his unwavering help and promised him I would have the physical documents on his desk by dawn. I walked out of the towering office building and stepped back into the cold, fading Boston afternoon. The seasoned financial analyst had successfully mapped the fraudulent web. Now the betrayed, desperate wife had to figure out how to bypass 2 violent guard dogs, a locked compound, and a hostile brother-in-law under the cover of absolute darkness. The freezing pre-dawn air hit my lungs like shattered glass the moment I slipped out of the heavy warehouse doors. I sprinted across the gravel lot, keeping my body pressed low against the shadows of the commercial trucks I had personally financed. Behind me, I could hear Todd's aggressive guard dog barking wildly into the dark. I threw myself into the driver's seat of my sedan, my hands shaking so violently that I scraped my knuckles against the steering column, trying to force the key into the ignition. I did not turn on my headlights until I was 3 blocks away from the property. When the dull orange glow of the street lamps finally washed over my windshield, I let out a jagged, breathless gasp. Resting on the passenger seat right next to my purse was the physical leather-bound ledger. I had done it. I had walked into the belly of the beast and extracted the exact paper trail of my husband's magnificent betrayal. I drove straight through the sleeping city of Boston, the roads completely empty at 5 a.m. My mind was a chaotic storm of adrenaline and heartbreak, but the veteran financial analyst inside me was steering the ship now. I arrived at Thomas Sterling's office building before the sun even crested the horizon. He was waiting for me in the underground parking garage, holding 2 steaming cups of black coffee. He did not offer any empty platitudes or ask how I was holding up. He just looked at the heavy ledger clutched against my chest, nodded sharply, and led me up the private executive elevator. We spread the documents across his massive mahogany desk under the harsh glare of the fluorescent office lights. For the next hour, the only sound in the room was the sharp turning of pages and the heavy scratching of Thomas taking notes on a yellow legal pad. Every fake vendor invoice from Creek Holdings was there. every fraudulently authorized wire transfer, every dollar of corporate revenue Richard had actively hidden from the federal government to fund his pregnant mistress in her downtown luxury penthouse. "We have him," Thomas finally said, breaking the heavy silence. His voice was a low, gravelly whisper of pure professional satisfaction. "This is not just a messy divorce, Evelyn. This is federal wire fraud. This is severe tax evasion. The paper trail is absolute perfection. He is incredibly arrogant, and that arrogance has made him incredibly sloppy." I took a slow sip of the bitter coffee, letting the dark liquid burn the back of my throat. "But the $850,000 from the forged home equity loan is still sitting in the holding account," I reminded him, my voice tight with lingering panic. "The bank halted the transfer because they flagged the offshore destination. Richard knows there is a delay. He is going to force me to sign those fake tax papers today to bypass the security freeze. If that money moves to Aspen, it vanishes, and I am left paying a fraudulent mortgage for the rest of my life." Thomas reached for his desk phone. "That is exactly why I called in the heavy artillery. You do not just need a forensic accountant anymore, Evelyn. You need a shark." 10 minutes later, the heavy oak door of the office swung open. The man who walked in did not look like a standard family law attorney. David was impeccably dressed in a tailored navy suit with sharp, calculating eyes that missed absolutely nothing. He carried a battered leather briefcase and moved with the distinct, unyielding energy of a man who spent his entire life destroying people in courtrooms. Thomas had briefed him on the phone while I was driving over. David did not offer me a sympathetic smile or a warm handshake. He pulled out a chair, sat down directly across from me, and folded his hands on the table. "Evelyn," he began, his voice carrying a crisp, authoritative edge. "Thomas tells me your husband is attempting to steal nearly $1 million of your secured equity to buy a mountain house for his mistress, while leaving you buried in corporate debt." I swallowed hard and met his intense gaze. "Yes, he forged my signature on a home equity line of credit. The transfer is pending. He is trying to trick me into signing the final authorization this morning by hiding it inside a stack of routine corporate tax extensions." David leaned forward, his eyes locking onto mine. "Then we are going to drop a financial guillotine on his neck. But to do that, I need you to understand exactly how the legal machinery operates. We are going to file an ex parte emergency motion for a temporary restraining order and a complete hard freeze on every single asset attached to his name, his social security number, and his corporate entity. An ex parte motion means we go to the judge in secret. Richard will have absolutely no idea it is happening until the bank tellers literally lock him out of his own accounts." A wave of desperate relief washed over me. "Do it," I said immediately. "File it right now. Stop the transfer." David held up a single, perfectly manicured finger. "Here is the massive complication, Evelyn. The legal system is powerful, but it is not instantaneous. I can draft the motion in an hour. I can get it in front of a friendly superior court judge by noon today. But once the judge signs the order, it has to be legally processed and routed through the federal banking system. It takes exactly 48 hours for a hard asset freeze to take complete effect across state lines and offshore holding accounts." The relief shattered instantly. 48 hours. I stared at the attorney, my chest tightening with sheer terror. "David, I do not have 48 hours. Richard is a coiled spring right now. He knows the bank is holding the wire. He demanded I sign those papers yesterday, and I barely bought myself one night by faking a severe migraine. He is going to shove that pen into my hand the second I walk back into that house. If I refuse to sign it, he will know I found out. He will panic. He will drain the legitimate operating accounts, empty the safe, and disappear before your judge even picks up a pen." "You cannot refuse to sign," David stated flatly, his tone absolute and uncompromising. "If you confront him, if you scream at him, if you give him even a single fraction of a hint that you know about the mistress or the stolen equity, you will lose the money forever. He will burn the house down on his way out the door. You have to go back to the suburbs this morning, and you have to play the role of the obedient, trusting, and visible wife perfectly." I looked back and forth between Thomas and David. My mind was spinning. You are telling me I have to walk into my kitchen, look the man who is trying to destroy my life in the eye, and voluntarily sign the document that gives him permission to steal my house. I am telling you to buy us 48 hours. David corrected, his voice dropping to an intense, focused whisper. You are a brilliant financial mind, Evelyn. You managed his books for a decade. Find a way to stall the machinery from the inside. But do not blow your cover. Your absolute silence is the only weapon we have left, until the judge's ink dries on that freeze order. I drove back to the suburbs as the morning sun finally broke through the clouds, painting the Boston skyline in shades of brilliant gold. The world looked completely normal. Commuters were drinking coffee in their cars. School buses were picking up children. But inside the cabin of my sedan, the air felt heavy and suffocating. I had spent 18 years making myself small. I had abandoned my master's degree to fund his first work truck. I had worn cheap shoes so he could wear custom suits. I had cooked his meals, managed his calendar, and balanced his ledgers entirely for free. I had built the very foundation of the man who was currently waiting to ruin me. And now the lawyers were telling me I had to shrink myself one last time. I pulled into our long, winding driveway. Richard's heavy-duty customized work truck was parked directly near the front door. He had not gone to the commercial site. He was waiting for me. I turned off the engine and sat in the quiet car for a full minute. I closed my eyes and buried the rage deep down into a dark, locked vault inside my chest. I smoothed my hair, adjusted my coat, and forced my facial muscles to relax into the soft, compliant expression I had worn for nearly 2 decades. I opened the front door and stepped into the foyer. The house was aggressively quiet. The smell of fresh coffee drifted from the kitchen, but there was an electric, dangerous tension vibrating in the air. I walked down the hardwood hallway, taking slow, deliberate steps. Richard was in the kitchen. He was pacing back and forth in front of the granite island like a caged predator. He was wearing his tailored suit, but his tie was pulled loose and his hair was slightly disheveled. The moment he heard my footsteps, he snapped his head toward the doorway. His eyes were wide, bloodshot, and completely frantic. "Where the hell have you been?" he demanded, his voice echoing sharply against the custom tile. I stopped in the doorway, keeping my posture relaxed and slightly weary. I went to the 24-hour pharmacy downtown. Richard lied smoothly, letting a hint of exhaustion bleed into my tone. My migraine came back with a vengeance around 4 a.m. I needed the prescription strength medication and the local clinic was closed. He stared at me, searching my face for any microscopic crack in the narrative. His jaw was clenched so tightly I could see a muscle jumping in his cheek. He did not care that I was sick. He did not care that I was in pain. He only cared about the massive offshore wire transfer that was currently stalled by a bank security hold. "Fine," he snapped, completely dismissing my fake illness. "Are you capable of reading right now? Is your vision clear enough to hold a pen?" "I am feeling much better," I promised, offering him a weak, trusting smile. "The medication is finally kicking in. I am sorry I was so useless yesterday." He did not offer a comforting word in return. He turned around, grabbed his heavy leather briefcase from the kitchen counter, and violently ripped open the brass clasps. He pulled out the thick manila envelope, the one containing the forged bank transfer authorization for the $850,000 home equity loan. He slammed the envelope down onto the granite island right next to my coffee mug. "Then we need to finish this right now, Evelyn," he said, his tone entirely too sharp, entirely too desperate. "The accountant has been calling me all morning. If we do not file these quarterly extensions by 9 o'clock, we are going to face massive federal penalties." He pulled the documents out of the envelope and slapped them onto the counter. He quickly flipped past the first few pages of actual tax jargon, completely covering the paragraphs with his large hand, intentionally hiding the loan transfer details buried at the back of the packet. He pointed to the final signature line at the bottom of the last page. He picked up his expensive silver pen and held it out toward me. "Just sign right here on the bottom line," he instructed, his breathing shallow and rapid. "Date it for today. I will run it directly to the office." I stepped slowly up to the granite island. I looked down at the crisp white paper. I looked at the black line demanding my legal consent. My heart began to hammer violently against my ribs, a heavy, dreadful thud that echoed in my ears. The advice from the ruthless divorce attorney rang loudly in my head. If you confront him, you lose the money forever. Find a way to stall the machinery from the inside. I reached out and took the silver pen from his hand. The metal felt ice cold against my skin. If I refused to sign, he would instantly know the truth. He would see the realization in my eyes. He would drain the business accounts run to his pregnant mistress and vanish to Aspen before David could even file the emergency injunction. But if I signed the paper, I was formally authorizing the bank to release the security freeze. I would be legally validating the forged home equity loan. The $850,000 I had bled myself dry to earn would immediately wire into the untraceable offshore account. I would lose my home. Richard was leaning over the counter, watching my hand with predatory anticipation. "Sign it, Evelyn," he urged, pushing the paper a fraction of an inch closer to my chest. I looked at the signature line, and then the brilliant veteran financial analyst inside my mind finally saw the exit door. The bank was currently holding the massive wire transfer because of a fraud alert. They were requiring this specific addendum to verify that the legal CO owner of the property genuinely consented to the movement of the funds. They were going to take this piece of paper and heavily scrutinize the wet ink signature, comparing it directly to the master signature card they had kept on file for me since we opened our joint accounts a decade ago. Richard had practiced my signature for months to forge the original loan document. He had perfectly replicated my loops and my exact cursive slant. But he could not forge this final authorization because he needed a notary stamp and a witness log that would require my physical presence. He needed my actual hand to complete the illusion. I realized with absolute crystal clarity that I did not need to refuse to sign. I just needed to sign it wrong. If I intentionally altered my own signature, if I changed the slant, connected the wrong letters, and completely bastardized my own handwriting, the bank fraud department would immediately reject the document. The automated security software would flag the catastrophic mismatch. It would trigger a mandatory manual review, locking the transfer in administrative purgatory. It would not stop the theft permanently, but it would absolutely stall the bank for the next 48 hours. It would buy David the exact amount of time he needed to drop the federal freeze on Richard's head. I looked up at my husband. I offered him the sweetest, most devoted smile I had ever mustered in my entire life. "Of course, Richard," I said softly. "Anything to help the business." I pressed the tip of the silver pen against the white paper. I took a slow, silent breath. And then, with cold, calculated precision, I began to write the clumsiest, most jagged, and entirely inaccurate version of my own name, leaving the perfect sabotage hiding in plain sight. Friday morning arrived with a suffocating humidity that pressed heavily against the large bay windows of our suburban home. It had been exactly 48 hours since I deliberately ruined my own signature on the bank authorization forms. 48 hours of moving through my own house like a silent ghost, carefully avoiding the man who was actively trying to destroy my life. Today was the official weekend of our 10th wedding anniversary. When I woke up, the sprawling green lawn of our property was already swarming with delivery trucks and event staff. Richard had spared absolutely no expense for this celebration. He had hired a premium catering company, a live jazz band, and a team of professional decorators to transform our backyard into a luxury venue. I stood in the kitchen holding a cup of black coffee, watching workers assemble massive white tents and string thousands of warm fairy lights through the branches of the ancient oak trees. I had paid for those trees to be professionally pruned every spring. I had paid the mortgage on the ground they were driving their heavy stakes into. And Richard was using the remaining legitimate funds in our corporate account to throw a massive, lavish party just days before he planned to declare bankruptcy. The sheer audacity of his performance was staggering. He walked into the kitchen wearing a pair of casual tailored trousers and a crisp linen shirt, looking incredibly relaxed and entirely victorious. He poured himself a cup of coffee and wrapped a warm, heavy arm around my shoulders. He actually kissed my temple. Happy anniversary weekend, sweetheart, he murmured, his voice smooth and untroubled. The event coordinator says the main stage will be finished by noon. This is going to be the most incredible night of our lives. It took every ounce of willpower I possessed not to physically violently pull away from his touch. His skin against mine felt like a burning iron. I forced my facial muscles to relax into a soft, appreciative smile. I leaned gently into his embrace, playing the role of the devoted, grateful wife. "It looks absolutely beautiful, Richard," I said, keeping my voice light and airy. "You have put so much work into making this perfect for us." He beamed at the compliment, completely blinded by his own towering arrogance. He thought he had already won. He thought the poorly signed tax document I handed him 2 days ago had successfully cleared the bank's security freeze. He assumed the stolen $850,000 of our home equity was quietly routing its way into the untraceable offshore account for Creek Holdings while we drank coffee in the kitchen. As he walked outside to direct the lighting technicians, the veteran financial analyst inside my mind began to dissect his strategy. Why would a man who was planning to steal $1 million and abandon his wife to complete financial ruin throw a massive public party just 48 hours before his escape? The answer materialized with chilling clarity. It was the perfect bulletproof alibi. Richard had invited over 100 people to this event. He had invited our wealthiest landscaping clients, the prominent real estate developers we contracted with, and even a few local city council members. He was setting a public stage. He wanted 100 influential witnesses to see a thriving, successful businessman and a blissfully happy marriage. When the corporate bank account suddenly emptied on Monday morning and the company collapsed into sudden bankruptcy, he would play the victim of a catastrophic market failure. He would act shocked and devastated. He would tell everyone that the financial stress was simply too much, and that our perfect marriage had tragically crumbled under the sudden crushing weight of the corporate debt. No one would ever suspect that the charming, devoted husband pouring champagne at his anniversary party had been methodically plotting his own fraudulent disappearance for months. It was a brilliant, terrifying plan. And if I had not listened to my terrified housekeeper 3 days ago, it would have worked flawlessly. The afternoon faded into a warm, breezy evening, and the guests began to arrive. The backyard looked like a scene from an expensive movie. Waiters in crisp white uniforms circulated through the crowd, carrying silver trays of seared scallops and expensive imported wine. The jazz band played a smooth, upbeat melody that floated over the gentle murmur of conversation and laughter. I walked down the sweeping back staircase wearing a tailored emerald green dress that I had bought specifically for this occasion. I did not look like a victim. I did not look like a woman who was hours away from losing everything. I moved through the crowd with absolute grace, greeting our wealthy clients by their first names, asking about their children, and ensuring their glasses were never empty. I was the invisible engine of Caldwell Luxury Landscapes, performing my final unpaid shift as the perfect corporate hostess. I saw the local mayor standing near the outdoor bar, and I walked over to charm him. I listened to him praise Richard's incredible business acumen. I smiled and nodded, agreeing with every word while silently remembering the long, exhausted nights I had spent completely alone at my kitchen table, rewriting Richard's disastrously sloppy business proposals so the city would actually approve our contracts. I had built the very foundation this man was currently being praised for. About an hour into the party, I felt a sharp, deliberate tap on my shoulder. I turned around and found myself face to face with Sarah and Todd. Richard's sister and brother had always treated me with a thick layer of condescending tolerance. But tonight, their smugness was radiating from them like heat off an asphalt road. Sarah was wearing a highly expensive silk designer dress that I instantly recognized. It was from a luxury boutique downtown. A boutique I knew for a fact she could not afford on her salary as a part-time substitute teacher. My company corporate ledgers had paid for that dress through a fake vendor invoice. "Evelyn, you look so tired," Sarah said, offering a sickly sweet smile that did not reach her cold eyes. "Are you feeling okay? You really should let Richard handle the hosting tonight. You always push yourself entirely too hard for a business you do not even really understand." I looked at her perfectly manicured nails and her expensive jewelry. I knew exactly what she was doing. She knew about the stolen equity. She knew about the pregnant mistress waiting in the downtown penthouse. She was actively participating in the theft of my life, and she was standing in my backyard drinking my expensive wine and mocking my impending destruction to my face. "I am feeling wonderful, Sarah," I replied, my voice dripping with genuine warmth. "I just want tonight to be completely unforgettable for everyone in the family." Todd let out a loud, abrasive laugh. He took a heavy gulp of his bourbon and leaned closely toward me. He smelled like cheap cologne and bad intentions. "You have no idea, Evelyn," he slurred slightly, his eyes gleaming with malicious secret knowledge. "Things are going to change so fast around here. Richard has been working like a dog. He is exhausted. He deserves a massive reward. Honestly, I think he needs to take a long, permanent vacation somewhere quiet. Maybe out west. Maybe the mountains in Aspen." My heart beat one heavy, steady rhythm against my ribs. Todd was pushing his luck, dangling the truth right in front of me because he believed I was too stupid to catch the reference. He thought he was the clever brother helping pull off the heist of the century. He had absolutely no idea that less than 48 hours ago, I had broken into his highly secured commercial warehouse in the dead of night. He did not know that while his guard dogs were barking outside, I had correctly guessed the combination to his office safe. He did not know that I had photographed every single page of the physical ledger, proving he was taking a 10% cut of the fraudulent offshore transfers. "Aspen sounds absolutely beautiful, Todd," I said, keeping my expression perfectly blank and deeply pleasant. "I hear the real estate out there is incredibly expensive right now. You really have to make sure your finances are completely secure before making a move like that." Todd blinked, his smug smile faltering for just a fraction of a second as his slightly intoxicated brain tried to process my words. But before he could analyze the hidden threat, Sarah grabbed his arm and pulled him away toward the catering tent, whispering something furiously into his ear. I turned away from them and took a long, slow sip of my sparkling water. The sky above the property was turning a deep bruised purple. The fairy lights glowed brightly, illuminating the laughing faces of the guests. It was a beautiful lie, perfectly constructed and meticulously maintained. I moved through the crowd for another hour, playing the game with flawless precision. I laughed at terrible jokes. I accepted warm congratulations on 10 years of successful marriage. I watched Richard work the perimeter of the yard, shaking hands and slapping backs, looking like a man who owned the entire world. He caught my eye from across the patio and raised his crystal glass to me in a silent, mocking toast. He was drinking to his victory. He was drinking to his new life with Chloe and their unborn child. I raised my glass back to him. I was drinking to his absolute total ruin. The timeline David had given me was echoing loudly in my mind. The ruthless divorce attorney had promised to file the ex parte emergency motion for a hard asset freeze the moment the courts opened on Thursday morning. But he had warned me that the federal banking machinery moved slowly. It took a full 48 hours for a judge to review the evidence, authorize the warrants, and physically lock down the offshore holding accounts. My intentionally botched signature on the bank authorization forms had stalled the fraudulent wire transfer just long enough to keep the money from vanishing into thin air. But the window was incredibly narrow. It was now Friday evening. The weekend was rapidly approaching. If the judge had declined the motion, or if the federal fraud unit needed more time to review the physical ledgers I had stolen from the warehouse, I was out of options. If the sun went down tonight and the legal net did not fall, Richard would realize the bank transfer had failed. He would log into the account, see the rejected signature, and know I had betrayed him. The jazz band finished a lively set, and the lead singer stepped up to the microphone. "Ladies and gentlemen, if I could have your attention, please," the singer announced, his voice echoing clearly over the massive speakers. "Our wonderful host, Richard Caldwell, would like to say a few words to his beautiful wife to celebrate this incredible milestone." The crowd erupted into enthusiastic applause. Guests began to move toward the center of the patio, forming a large half circle around the main stage area. The waiters stopped circulating. The bartenders paused their mixing. Everyone turned their attention to the handsome, successful businessman stepping confidently up to the microphone. I stood near the edge of the crowd, my hands resting lightly on the cool stone of the patio retaining wall. Richard tapped the microphone, causing a soft feedback whine that immediately quieted the remaining whispers. He looked out over the sea of faces, his expression shifting into a mask of deep, profound humility and overwhelming love. "Thank you all so much for coming tonight," Richard began, his voice thick with practiced, manufactured emotion. 10 years ago, I was just a guy with a lawnmower and a dream. I had absolutely nothing. But I had one person who believed in me when no one else did. He paused, letting the crowd absorb the narrative. Several women in the audience let out soft, sympathetic sighs. "My wife, Evelyn." He continued, gesturing warmly toward where I was standing. "She has been the quiet, invisible backbone of Caldwell Luxury Landscapes. She sacrificed her own ambitions to support mine. She stood by me through the hardest, darkest days of building this company. I stand before you tonight a successful man completely because of the love and devotion of that incredible woman." The guests clapped politely. Sarah and Todd were standing near the front row, clapping the loudest, exchanging knowing, amused glances with each other. They were enjoying the performance. They were watching him publicly humiliate me, feeding me empty words of gratitude, while actively plotting to leave me with absolutely nothing. Richard reached into the inner pocket of his tailored suit jacket and pulled out a small, flat velvet box. "Evelyn, sweetheart," he said, his voice dropping to an intimate whisper that carried perfectly across the silent yard. "I want to give you this token of my endless appreciation. Come up here, please." The crowd parted for me like the Red Sea. I felt 100 pairs of eyes watching my every movement. I took a slow, deep breath. I smoothed the front of my emerald dress and began to walk toward the stage. My legs felt heavy, like I was moving through deep water. Every step brought me closer to the man who had destroyed my life. Every step felt like walking toward an executioner. Suddenly, a sharp, aggressive vibration buzzed violently against my hip. I stopped walking. I was standing directly in the middle of the crowd, completely exposed. The guests were looking at me expectantly, waiting for me to walk up the steps and accept my anniversary gift. Richard was smiling, holding out his hand. The phone in my hidden dress pocket vibrated again. A double buzz. It was the specific notification tone I had assigned strictly for David, my attorney. I did not care that 100 people were watching me. I did not care that Richard was looking slightly confused by my sudden halt. I reached into the deep pocket of my dress, pulled out my cell phone, and looked down at the glowing screen. The text message was brief. It contained only 2 sentences. But those 2 sentences were the most beautiful words I had ever read in my entire life. The judge signed the emergency freeze. The federal fraud unit has secured the warrants. A second message immediately populated right below it. "The net is closed, Evelyn. Drop the hammer." I stared at the screen, and a profound, heavy silence seemed to wash over the entire world. The jazz band, the murmuring guests, the clinking glasses, it all faded away into absolute nothingness. The crushing, suffocating weight I had been carrying on my chest for the last 72 hours instantly vanished. The fear, the panic, the desperate need to survive it evaporated into the warm night air. I locked the phone screen and slipped the device back into my pocket. I looked up at the stage. Richard was still standing there holding the velvet box, his fake smile beginning to look slightly strained at the edges. "Evelyn," he prompted, his tone carrying a slight edge of genuine annoyance. "Come open your gift." I took the final steps up onto the wooden stage. I stood directly in front of him under the bright glare of the stage lights. I looked into the eyes of the man I had loved for 18 years. I saw the arrogance, the cruelty, and the absolute certainty that he was the smartest person in the room. He did not know that the federal government had just locked every single bank account attached to his Social Security number. He did not know that his offshore transfer had been permanently killed. He did not know that his pregnant mistress was currently sitting in a downtown penthouse that he could no longer pay for. I reached out and took the small velvet box from his hand. "Thank you, Richard," I said, my voice carrying clearly over the open microphone. It is exactly what I deserve. I turned to face the crowd of 100 guests. I looked at the local politicians, the wealthy clients, and the smug faces of Sarah and Todd in the front row. The veteran financial analyst was stepping up to the podium, and it was finally time to present the audit. I stood perfectly still under the warm glow of the outdoor stage lights. The gentle evening breeze carried the scent of expensive catered food and expensive perfume across our massive backyard. 100 of the wealthiest and most influential people in our suburban community were watching us. My husband Richard stood right beside me, holding the microphone, with the effortless charm of a seasoned politician. He tapped the metal grill gently, sending a soft thump echoing through the towering outdoor speakers. The gentle murmur of the crowd instantly faded into respectful silence. Waiters stopped pouring wine. The jazz band lowered their instruments. Everyone turned their attention to the handsome, successful business owner who was about to honor his devoted wife of 10 years. "Thank you all so much for being here tonight," Richard began. His voice dropping into that smooth, intimate register he usually reserved for closing massive landscaping contracts. He looked out over the sea of faces, his eyes shining with manufactured emotion. 10 years ago, I was just a guy with a rusted lawnmower and a dream that felt entirely too big for my empty pockets. I had absolutely nothing to my name except ambition and a desperate need to succeed. But I had one person who believed in me when no one else did. He paused dramatically, letting the silence hang in the crisp autumn air. A few women in the front row let out soft, sympathetic sighs. Sarah and Todd were standing near the outdoor bar, smiling smugly at the performance, completely aware of the horrific betrayal that was hiding just beneath the surface of this expensive celebration. My beautiful wife, Evelyn Richard, continued turning his body toward me and reaching out to take my hand. His fingers felt like ice against my skin, and my stomach churned with absolute revulsion, but I forced myself to hold on. I smiled up at him, playing the role of the blushing, grateful spouse one final time. She has been the quiet, invisible backbone of Caldwell Luxury Landscapes. She sacrificed her own incredible career ambitions in finance to support mine. She stood by me through the hardest, darkest days of building this company from the ground up. She handled the late nights, the tight budgets, and the endless stress without a single complaint. I stand before you tonight a highly successful man completely because of the relentless love and devotion of that incredible woman. The guests erupted into polite, enthusiastic applause. I looked out at the local city council members, the wealthy real estate developers, and the high net worth clients who funded our lifestyle. They were clapping for an illusion. They were applauding a man who had spent the last several months systematically plotting to leave me bankrupt and homeless, discarding me like garbage the moment my financial utility ran out. Richard reached into the inner pocket of his tailored charcoal suit jacket and pulled out a small flat velvet box. "Evelyn, sweetheart," he said, raising the microphone slightly, so his intimate whisper would carry perfectly across the silent yard. "I want to give you this token of my endless appreciation. It is just a small symbol of what you mean to me. You deserve the entire world." The crowd parted slightly, giving us the perfect center stage moment. Cameras flashed from the front row as guests captured the romantic scene. I reached out with a steady hand and took the small velvet box from his grasp. I opened the lid slowly, letting the suspense build for the audience. Resting on the cheap synthetic silk lining was a thin, generic silver necklace. It was the kind of hastily purchased, uninspired jewelry you could buy at a mall kiosk on a Tuesday afternoon. It probably cost less than the bottle of imported wine he was currently drinking. Meanwhile, his pregnant mistress Chloe was sitting in a downtown luxury penthouse, surrounded by thousands of dollars of custom furniture funded entirely by my stolen home equity. I looked down at the cheap necklace. I did not grimace. I smiled. It was the warmest, brightest, most forgiving smile I had worn in 18 years. "Thank you, Richard," I said softly, ensuring my voice was picked up by the microphone he was holding. "This is incredibly thoughtful. I will treasure it exactly as much as you treasure me." I reached out and gently took the microphone from his hand. The heavy metal felt grounding. It felt like power. For nearly 2 decades, I had allowed him to be the voice of our family, the charismatic frontman who took all the credit, while I did all the heavy lifting in the shadows. Tonight, the shadows were stepping into the spotlight. I turned to face the crowd of 100 guests. The veteran financial analyst was finally stepping up to the podium, and it was time to present the final audit. Thank you all for coming to celebrate this incredible milestone with us. I began, my voice ringing clear and steady over the massive speakers. I looked directly into the eyes of our most important corporate clients. Richard is absolutely right. We have built an incredible life together. We have built a massive, highly profitable company. We have secured a beautiful home in a wonderful neighborhood. And tonight, to celebrate our 10-year anniversary, I wanted to share a very special presentation that truly captures the absolute reality of our marriage and our business. I gestured toward the massive white projector screen that the event staff had erected near the edge of the patio. The lighting technicians had set it up to play a continuous loop of our professional wedding photos. I reached into my dress pocket and pulled out a small wireless presentation remote. I took a slow, deep breath, centering myself in the calm, calculating energy of a forensic accountant preparing to destroy a fraudulent ledger. I clicked the right arrow button. The soft, romantic wedding photos instantly vanished. The screen went completely black for a fraction of a second. Then a massive, glaringly bright digital document illuminated the backyard, casting a harsh white glow over the faces of the confused guests. It was the forged home equity line of credit contract. The text was blown up to massive proportions, making the dense legal jargon and the staggering financial figures perfectly legible to anyone standing within 50 feet of the stage. The crowd stared at the screen in mild confusion. A few people squinted, leaning forward, trying to understand why a complicated banking document had suddenly replaced the expected anniversary slideshow. Richard let out a nervous, confused chuckle, clearly thinking I had made a technical error. "Evelyn, sweetheart," he whispered urgently, leaning close to my ear and grabbing my elbow. "What is this? You loaded the wrong file. Turn it off." I pulled my elbow sharply out of his grasp and took a slow, deliberate step away from him. I raised the microphone back to my lips. "What you are looking at right now," I announced to the puzzled crowd, "is a legal home equity loan agreement for exactly $850,000. It was secretly taken out against this very house. The house that I personally paid off 3 years ago using my own freelance consulting income. If you look closely at the bottom of the screen, you will see 2 authorization signatures." I clicked the remote again. The projector zoomed in heavily on the signature line, filling the massive screen with the dark black ink. "The first signature belongs to my husband, Richard Caldwell." I continued, my voice perfectly level, completely devoid of any tears, hysteria, or traditional heartbreak. "The second signature supposedly belongs to me. But I never signed this document. My husband spent months perfectly practicing my handwriting so he could forge my legal consent and completely drain the massive equity from our marital home." A sharp collective gasp rippled through the audience. The polite celebratory anniversary party atmosphere shattered instantly. People stopped drinking. The bartenders froze with bottles hovering over crystal glasses. Todd and Sarah stepped away from the outdoor bar, their smug, condescending smiles violently erased, replaced by looks of absolute terror. "Evelyn, stop this right now, Richard," hissed his voice, dropping into a dark, threatening growl. He lunged toward me, trying to grab the microphone from my hands to silence me. I quickly sidestepped him, keeping my distance and maintaining my composure. I clicked the remote a 3rd time. The forged loan document vanished. It was immediately replaced by a highly detailed, color-coded corporate accounting ledger that I had extracted directly from his hidden warehouse safe. "Richard Caldwell has spent tonight telling you all about his incredible business acumen and his massive success," I told the crowd, speaking smoothly over his angry, desperate protests. "But Caldwell Luxury Landscapes is not just a landscaping company anymore. It has recently become a massive front for federal wire fraud and severe corporate tax evasion." The local city council members sitting in the front row suddenly looked horrified. One of the prominent real estate developers, a man who had recently signed a massive commercial contract with Richard, actually dropped his wine glass onto the stone patio. It shattered with a loud crash, sending glass scattering across the concrete, but no one looked down. Everyone was completely paralyzed, staring at the glowing screen. I clicked the remote, rapidly flashing a series of digital invoices across the massive outdoor display. These are fake vendor receipts. I explained, pacing slowly across the wooden stage so everyone could hear me clearly. Richard has been aggressively funneling hundreds of thousands of dollars of our legitimate corporate revenue into a shell company called Creek Holdings. He categorized these massive transfers as premium soil and heavy machinery maintenance. He deducted them on our joint federal tax returns as legitimate business expenses, effectively stealing from the federal government and exposing me, his loyal wife, to severe federal prison time. Richard was completely panicked now. His tailored suit looked suddenly too large for his shrinking, terrified posture. Sweat was pouring down his forehead. "Turn the projector off!" he screamed at the lighting technicians who were standing frozen near the soundboard. "Cut the power right now! I will fire all of you. Cut the power." Nobody moved. The technicians just stared at him in shock, completely captivated by the unfolding disaster. I clicked the remote and again. The fake invoices disappeared. A brilliant high-resolution photograph of a sprawling luxury penthouse in downtown Boston filled the screen, showing floor-to-ceiling windows and custom marble countertops. "But Creek Holdings is not a commercial soil vendor," I said, my voice rising powerfully over the rising murmur of the horrified crowd. "Creek Holdings is the corporate shell entity that pays the $12,000 monthly rent on this spectacular downtown luxury penthouse." I clicked the remote again. A photograph of a young, beautiful, visibly pregnant blonde woman appeared on the screen. She was standing in the marble foyer of the penthouse, resting her hand protectively over her stomach. Right behind her, leaning casually against the expensive wainscoting, was the custom set of Titleist golf clubs I had purchased for Richard for our anniversary last year. "This is Chloe." I introduced her to the silent, breathless audience. She is 25 years old. She is currently 7 months pregnant with my husband's child. And she has been living like absolute royalty in that downtown penthouse, funded entirely by the unpaid labor I have provided as the invisible chief financial officer of this company. "Oh my God!" a woman in the second row whispered loudly, covering her mouth with both hands. "That is absolutely repulsive." Richard was hyperventilating. His chest heaved violently. He looked like a trapped animal, his eyes darting frantically around the yard, searching for an exit, searching for a way to stop the relentless public exposure of his monstrous lies. He was planning to finalize the ultimate betrayal today, I told the crowd, bringing the presentation to its devastating climax. I clicked the remote one final time. The photograph of the pregnant mistress vanished. It was replaced by a massive high-contrast screenshot of a text message conversation. The sender was listed as Richard Burner Phone. The recipient was Chloe. The text on the screen was massive and impossible to misinterpret. I read the agonizing words aloud, forcing Richard to hear his own calculating cruelty broadcast to the entire world. "The money moves tomorrow," the text read. "Evelyn signed the tax papers this morning because she is entirely too stupid to check the fine print. Once the $850,000 hits, the offshore trust, we close on the Aspen house. I will file for corporate bankruptcy on Monday. She will be left holding the debt for the house, and the private lenders will foreclose on her by the end of the month. We will be drinking champagne in the mountains while she is out on the street." The silence that followed was absolute. It was a heavy, suffocating quiet. 100 wealthy, influential people stared at the screen, reading the cold, calculated plan to destroy a loyal wife and leave her completely homeless. The illusion of the perfect American marriage was entirely dead, replaced by the ugly, terrifying reality of severe financial abuse and absolute betrayal. Sarah let out a loud, pathetic sob from the back of the crowd, burying her face in her hands. Todd looked physically sick, stepping backward into the shadows, realizing that his own complicity in the warehouse fraud was about to be dragged into the brutal daylight. Richard finally snapped. A blind, desperate rage consumed him. He let out a furious, primal scream and lunged across the wooden stage, ignoring me entirely and diving straight for the small laptop that was plugged into the projector system. He frantically ripped the heavy power cords out of the wall socket. He grabbed the expensive laptop and violently smashed it against the stone patio. The digital screen shattered into pieces. The massive outdoor projector flashed blue and then powered down, plunging the presentation into darkness. The backyard was illuminated only by the warm fairy lights strung through the oak trees. Richard stood over the broken laptop, breathing heavily, his chest rising and falling in ragged, panicked gasps. He looked up at the crowd, wiping sweat from his brow, then slowly turned to face me. He thought he had stopped the bleeding. He thought destroying the machine would erase the truth. I looked at the broken plastic on the ground. I looked back up at my husband. I did not step away from him. I stood my ground, raised the microphone, and delivered the final devastating blow. "You can break the computer, Richard," I said, my voice ringing with absolute unyielding authority. "But it does not change the truth, and it absolutely does not change the law." He stared at me, his eyes wide and bloodshot. "What are you talking about?" he demanded, his voice shaking with sudden, terrifying realization. "You needed me to sign those routine tax extensions on Wednesday morning so the bank would release the security hold on your massive wire transfer," I explained slowly, ensuring every single guest in the yard heard exactly how his master plan had failed. "You needed my signature to validate the forged home equity loan and move the stolen money to Aspen before the weekend. But you forgot one critical detail, Richard. You forgot that I am the veteran financial analyst who built your entire accounting infrastructure." I took a step toward him. He instinctively took a step back, his arrogant facade completely crumbling. I did not sign my real name. I revealed, savoring the absolute shock on his face. I intentionally altered my own handwriting. I broke the cursive slant and completely bastardized my own signature. When you submitted that paper to the fraud department, the automated banking software immediately flagged the catastrophic mismatch against my master signature card. Richard's face drained of all color. He looked exactly like a ghost. He staggered backward, nearly tripping over the microphone cord. "No," he whispered, shaking his head frantically. "No, the bank manager said the transfer was clearing today." "The bank manager lied to you because federal investigators told him to," I replied coldly, driving the final nail into his coffin. My intentionally botched signature triggered a mandatory manual review. It stalled the wire transfer in administrative purgatory for exactly 48 hours. It gave my legal team the exact amount of time we needed to blindside you. I reached into my pocket and pulled out my cell phone. The screen was glowing brightly with the confirmation text message from my ruthless divorce attorney, David. "While you were busy setting up these massive white tents and pouring expensive champagne to create your perfect alibi." I continued, my voice echoing like a gavel striking a wooden block. "A federal superior court judge was reviewing the physical ledgers I extracted from your secure warehouse 3 nights ago. The same physical ledgers that prove you are running a massive corporate fraud scheme." Todd let out a loud curse from the back of the patio and turned to run toward the driveway, but several large men in the crowd immediately blocked his path, refusing to let him escape. "You cannot steal a house I legally secured 3 hours ago, Richard," I said, delivering the words with absolute final precision. "The judge signed an ex parte emergency motion this afternoon. Every single bank account attached to your Social Security number, your corporate tax identification, and your fraudulent offshore holding company has been subjected to a total hard federal asset freeze." Richard dropped to his knees. He actually fell onto the hard stone patio, the expensive fabric of his tailored trousers scraping against the concrete. "The money is not moving to Aspen, Richard," I told him, looking down at the man who had tried to ruin me. "The money is never moving. Your pregnant mistress is currently sitting in a downtown luxury penthouse that you can no longer afford to pay for. Your landscaping company is legally frozen. And because you used our legitimate business to commit federal tax evasion and wire fraud across state lines, the Federal Fraud Unit has already secured the warrants for your immediate arrest." The crowd erupted into total chaos. People were shouting. Sarah was screaming hysterically, realizing her own financial pipeline was severed. Several wealthy clients were already pulling out their phones, frantically calling their own attorneys to sever all professional ties with Caldwell Luxury Landscapes. The elegant, sophisticated anniversary party had completely collapsed into a scene of absolute devastating justice. Richard knelt on the ground, his hands covering his face, sobbing loudly in front of the people he had desperately tried to impress. He was a broken, ruined man, stripped of his wealth, his reputation, and his future. I stood above him, feeling the cool night air wash over my skin. I did not feel an ounce of pity. I did not feel an ounce of sorrow. For 18 years, I had made myself incredibly small so this man could feel massive. Now I was finally taking up my own space. I turned away from my sobbing husband, lowered the microphone, and looked out toward the front of the property. Through the massive wrought iron gates of our long, winding driveway, the flashing red and blue lights of local police cruisers began to reflect brightly against the autumn trees. The federal authorities had arrived to collect their evidence. The trap had perfectly flawlessly snapped shut. The sound of shattering plastic and tearing metal echoed violently across the stone patio. Richard stood over the broken remains of the presentation laptop, his chest heaving with ragged, panicked breaths. He had literally destroyed the machine with his bare hands, mistakenly believing that smashing the physical computer would somehow erase the devastating truth that had just been broadcast to 100 of the wealthiest people in our city. The massive outdoor projector screen went dark, plunging the immediate area into deep shadow, lit only by the warm, flickering fairy lights strung through the branches of the ancient oak trees. But the darkness did absolutely nothing to hide him. The damage was entirely permanent and incredibly public. The silence in the expansive backyard was heavy, suffocating, and charged with the electric current of absolute shock. No one spoke a single word. No one moved a muscle. The catering staff stood frozen by the outdoor bar, holding silver trays of expensive hors d'oeuvres that no one would ever eat. The local city councilmen and prominent real estate developers stared at the man they had been loudly applauding just 5 minutes ago, their expressions rapidly contorting from confusion into deep, unmistakable disgust. Then the heavy silence was violently broken by the sharp, aggressive clicking of high heels against the stone patio. It was Sarah. My sister-in-law pushed her way through the paralyzed crowd, her expensive silk designer dress rustling loudly in the quiet night air. Her face was flushed dark red with absolute indignation. She marched directly up to the edge of the wooden stage, positioning herself between me and her brother like a loyal shield. "You are completely out of your mind, Evelyn," Sarah shouted, her voice shrill and trembling with desperate rage. "You fabricated all of those documents. You hacked into his business accounts and manipulated those digital invoices just to humiliate him because you are a bitter, jealous woman." She turned away from me to face the crowd, waving her hands frantically, her expensive jewelry sparkling under the patio lights. "Do not listen to a single word she says," Sarah pleaded with the wealthy clients. "My brother is an honest, hard-working man. He has given this ungrateful woman absolutely everything. She is having a severe mental breakdown." Before I could even open my mouth to respond to her pathetic, enabling performance, Todd stepped out of the heavy shadows near the catering tent. He did not look nearly as confident or righteous as his sister. His face was slick with a thick layer of cold sweat, and his eyes darted nervously around the yard, actively measuring the horrified reactions of the wealthy guests. He walked up to the edge of the stage, holding both of his hands up in a placating gesture, trying desperately to play the voice of calm reason. "Evelyn, please," Todd said, his voice carrying a false soothing tone that made my skin crawl with revulsion. "Let us just calm down and take this discussion inside the house. You are making a massive, terrible mistake right now. You are misinterpreting standard corporate tax strategies. Richard was just trying to secure a better investment portfolio for your shared future. You are ruining the entire family business over a simple accounting misunderstanding." I stood perfectly still on the elevated wooden platform, looking down at the two siblings who had mocked me, belittled me, and actively participated in my planned destruction for years. I did not raise my voice. I did not need to scream to command the space. The microphone was still grasped firmly in my right hand. "Standard corporate tax strategies. I repeated into the microphone, letting the words roll slowly and clearly off my tongue so every single guest could hear them. That is a truly fascinating way to describe federal wire fraud, Todd. I took a slow, deliberate step toward the edge of the stage, looking directly into Todd's panicked, bloodshot eyes. I know exactly how standard your personal strategies are, I told him, because 3 nights ago at 2 a.m, I drove directly to your highly secured commercial equipment warehouse. I bypassed your aggressive guard dogs, unlocked the back office door with my master key, and opened the massive fireproof safe that Richard uses to hide his physical ledgers. Todd's jaw dropped. The false soothing expression melted off his face, instantly replaced by a mask of absolute paralyzing terror. I saw him take an involuntary step backward, nearly tripping over the edge of a decorative stone planter. You see, I continued, my voice echoing mercilessly across the silent yard. I know exactly what is locked inside that safe. I photographed every single page of the original wet ink ledgers. I know all about the fraudulent vendor accounts categorized as premium soil imports. And more importantly, I know about the 10% administrative cut that Richard has been wiring directly into your personal checking account for every single dollar you successfully funnel into the offshore holding company. A loud collective gasp went up from the audience. The local mayor, who had been standing near the front row sipping champagne, physically turned his back on the family in absolute disgust. Several prominent business owners began whispering furiously to their spouses, already calculating exactly how quickly they could call their own attorneys to sever their lucrative contracts with Caldwell Luxury Landscapes. You have been actively laundering your brother's stolen money right through the warehouse operating budget, I said, driving the final devastating nail into his coffin. I have the bank routing numbers. I have the exact transaction dates. I have the photographs of the deposit slips. And as of this morning, so does the Federal Fraud Investigation Unit. Sarah let out a sharp, breathless gasp and covered her mouth with both hands. She turned to stare at Todd, her eyes wide with sudden, unadulterated horror. Even she had not known that Todd was actively profiting from the massive theft. She genuinely thought she was just protecting her brother's secret romantic life, completely unaware that her other brother was taking a massive financial cut of the devastating fraud. Todd did not even try to deny the accusations. He could not form a single coherent word. He looked exactly like a man standing on a gallows trapdoor, waiting for the lever to be pulled. He spun around and sprinted toward the side gate of the yard, desperately trying to escape the property and flee into the dark suburban streets. But 2 burly men, wealthy clients who had personally trusted Richard and Todd with massive commercial landscaping contracts, immediately stepped directly into his path. They firmly blocked the exit, folding their arms across their chests and forcing the terrified man to stay right where he was. Richard watched his brother fail to escape the yard. He looked at the horrified faces of his family, his friends, and the influential politicians who had praised him all evening. He watched his entire social and professional reputation disintegrating into ash right before his very eyes. The charismatic, untouchable businessman was dead and buried. There was absolutely nothing left for him to salvage in the city of Boston. The only thing he had left in the entire world was the money, the $850,000 of stolen home equity that was sitting in the temporary banking hold, just waiting for the final authorization to be transferred to the secure Aspen Trust. A feral, desperate energy suddenly possessed my husband. If he could just push the final wire transfer through right now, if he could just empty the corporate accounts before the authorities arrived to ask questions, he could flee the state tonight. He could abandon the smoking ruins of his company, escape to his pregnant mistress waiting in the mountains, and disappear forever with $1 million in untraceable cash. Richard shoved his hand into the inner pocket of his ruined suit jacket and whipped out his personal smartphone. His fingers were shaking so violently that he nearly dropped the expensive device onto the hard stone patio. He gripped the phone with both hands, staring manically at the bright digital screen. I watched from the stage as his trembling thumb repeatedly failed the biometric security scan because his skin was entirely too slick with cold sweat. Cursing loudly under his breath, he frantically tapped his manual passcode into the glass, forcing the secure banking application to open. He was completely ignoring the crowd of 100 people now. He was completely ignoring me. He was operating on pure, blind, animalistic survival instinct. "What are you doing, Richard?" I asked, my voice ringing out over the towering speakers, cold, analytical, and entirely unyielding. "Are you trying to check your corporate balances? Are you praying that the offshore wire transfer to Creek Holdings finally cleared the security protocol?" The wealthy guests watched in absolute morbid fascination as Richard furiously tapped his way through the banking menus. The bright glow of the smartphone screen illuminated his pale, sweating face in the surrounding darkness. He looked incredibly pathetic. The man who had spent 18 years wearing custom-tailored suits and demanding absolute professional respect was now standing in the middle of his own anniversary party, frantically swiping at a digital screen like a common thief trying to pick a lock before the police sirens arrived. He hit the final confirmation button on the screen, attempting to manually execute the massive wire transfer and drain the accounts dry. He expected to see the familiar green confirmation checkmark. He expected to see his golden ticket to freedom. Instead, the bright glow reflecting off his face suddenly shifted color. The soft, comforting blue light of the banking application vanished completely. A harsh, bright crimson red illuminated his panicked, wide eyes. "No," Richard breathed, his voice a ragged, terrified whisper that barely carried past the first row of stunned guests. "No, that is impossible. That cannot be right." The bank manager promised me it would clear. He tapped the screen again, hitting the glass so hard I could hear the sharp click of his fingernail echoing in the quiet night. The screen flashed bright red a second time, refusing to process his desperate command. I walked slowly and deliberately down the wooden steps of the stage, the heavy microphone still grasped firmly in my hand. I approached him, stopping just 3 feet away. I did not feel an ounce of fear looking at this desperate man. I felt only the absolute cold satisfaction of a perfectly executed financial audit. "Account frozen," I said aloud, reading the exact warning words I knew were blazing across his restricted digital screen. "Federal hold applied. Please contact your branch manager immediately to resolve this severe security issue." Richard jerked his head up, staring at me with a chaotic mixture of absolute hatred and utter confusion. I signed the tax papers. He hissed, a thick string of spittle flying from his trembling lips. "You signed the final authorization form on Wednesday morning in the kitchen. I watched you do it." The bank manager told me the security hold would be lifted by the end of the day. "They lied to you, Richard," I replied, my voice perfectly steady and completely devoid of any human sympathy. "The bank manager lied to you because the federal fraud investigators instructed him to keep you calm so you would not attempt to flee the state. You really thought I was just a naive, obedient housewife who would blindly sign her own financial execution order without reading the fine print?" I asked, allowing a razor-thin edge of mockery to bleed into my tone. "You spent 18 years taking all the credit for my brilliant work. You actually forgot that I am the veteran financial analyst who built your entire corporate infrastructure from the ground up. You completely forgot that I know exactly how automated banking security software operates." I took one more step closer, forcing him to look me directly in the eye, forcing him to recognize the brilliant woman he had systematically tried to destroy. "When you pushed that expensive silver pen into my hand on Wednesday morning, I did exactly what you demanded," I explained, ensuring every single guest heard exactly how his master plan had failed. "I signed the document, but I did not sign my real name. I intentionally altered my handwriting. I deliberately broke my natural cursive slant, connected the wrong letters, and completely bastardized my own signature to ensure it looked like a sloppy forgery. The moment your accountant submitted that form to the banking fraud department, the automated security software instantly flagged the catastrophic mismatch against my master signature card," I revealed, savoring the absolute crushing shock blooming across his pale face. Richard's mouth fell completely open. His ragged breathing stopped entirely. He stared at me, his eyes wide and vacant, finally realizing the absolute magnitude of his fatal miscalculation. That intentional glaring error triggered a mandatory manual review, I explained to the breathless crowd, watching the execution. "It threw your massive wire transfer directly into administrative purgatory." It did not permanently stop the theft, but it stalled the banking machinery for exactly 48 hours. It gave my legal team the exact window of time we desperately needed. I said, my voice echoing like a heavy gavel striking a wooden block. While you were busy coordinating expensive catering menus and stringing fairy lights through the oak trees to build your perfect public alibi, my ruthless attorney was standing in a private room in front of a federal superior court judge. I raised my free hand and gestured to the sprawling property surrounding us. The judge reviewed the physical ledgers I extracted from your hidden safe. The judge saw the forged home equity documents and the fake vendor receipts funding your mistress in her downtown penthouse. And 3 hours ago, I continued delivering the final, inescapable truth that Judge signed an ex parte emergency motion granting a total hard asset freeze on every single account attached to your name, your social security number, and your fraudulent offshore holding company. The money is not moving to Aspen, Richard, I told him, looking down at the ruined man kneeling on the patio. The money is never moving. Your pregnant mistress is currently sitting in a $12,000 a month luxury apartment that you can no longer afford to pay for. Your landscaping empire is legally frozen and functionally dead. Your brother is implicated in a massive documented money laundering scheme. And because you used our legitimate business to commit federal tax evasion and wire fraud across state lines, you have absolutely nothing left to your name. Richard's legs simply gave out beneath him. He collapsed fully onto the cold stone patio, dropping his expensive smartphone onto the ground. The red error screen glowed brightly against the concrete, a glaring digital beacon of his absolute failure. He buried his face in his trembling hands, letting out a wretched, hollow sob that sounded less like a man crying and more like a wounded animal dying in a trap. The heavy silence in the backyard returned absolute and suffocating. The wealthy guests watched the ruined man weeping on the ground, completely stripped of his stolen wealth, his towering arrogance, and his impending freedom. Sarah stood frozen, weeping silently into her hands. Todd remained trapped by the gate, staring blankly into the darkness. Then, breaking through the quiet murmur of the crisp autumn wind, a new sound drifted over the tall privacy fences of our upscale suburban neighborhood. It started as a faint, high-pitched wail in the far distance, growing steadily louder, sharper, and incredibly urgent by the second. The wail split into multiple overlapping sirens, echoing sharply down the main avenue and turning directly onto our street. The federal fraud investigators had not just frozen the bank accounts, they had reviewed the forged loan documents that deliberately crossed state lines and immediately tipped off the local authorities regarding the massive theft. Flashing red and blue emergency lights began to bounce aggressively against the manicured oak trees at the front of the property, casting erratic, frantic shadows across the faces of the stunned anniversary guests. The heavy, unmistakable crunch of thick tires on gravel announced the arrival of multiple police cruisers pulling violently into our long, winding driveway. The financial guillotine had finally dropped and the executioners had arrived to collect the pieces. The flashing red and blue lights painted the manicured oak trees of our suburban yard in violent, chaotic strokes. The heavy crunch of gravel under the thick tires of the police cruisers sounded like the final definitive strike of a judge's gavel. For 18 years, Richard had meticulously built an illusion of absolute perfection. He had curated a life of tailored suits, expensive champagne, and powerful friends, all funded by my silent, unseen labor. Now that entire world was completely shattering in real time. 3 federal fraud investigators, flanked by local police officers, marched up our long, winding driveway with a terrifying, unyielding purpose. The wealthy guests, the city council members, and the prominent real estate developers who had been praising my husband just moments ago practically scrambled out of the way. Nobody wanted to be caught standing too close to a sinking ship. The elegant anniversary party had instantly transformed into a crime scene. Richard was still kneeling on the cold stone patio, staring blindly at the dark, broken remains of the presentation laptop he had violently smashed. When the lead federal investigator placed a heavy hand on his shoulder and ordered him to stand, the charismatic, towering businessman completely vanished. He looked incredibly small, fragile, and utterly defeated. He did not fight back. He did not shout his innocence to the terrified crowd. He simply let the officers pull his arms behind his back. The sharp metallic click of the steel handcuffs locking around his wrists echoed perfectly across the silent yard. It was the most satisfying sound I had ever heard. Todd tried to run. My brother-in-law, the man who had gladly taken a massive 10% cut of the stolen money while treating me with smug condescension, had slowly backed away toward the catering tent when the sirens first wailed. Seeing his brother in handcuffs, Todd made a desperate, panicked sprint toward the side gate. But the federal authorities had already secured the perimeter of the property. 2 large officers intercepted him before his expensive dress shoes even reached the grass. They slammed him firmly against the side of the catering van, patting him down and securing his wrists. Todd began to weep openly, loudly begging the officers for mercy, blaming his brother for everything, screaming that he was just a warehouse employee following corporate orders. It was a pathetic, cowardly display. Sarah, standing near the outdoor bar, covered her face with her trembling hands and wailed into the night sky. The family that had mocked my quiet obedience for nearly 2 decades was now being publicly brutally dismantled. I stood on the elevated wooden stage, completely untouched by the chaos unfolding on the patio below me. A female officer approached me, her expression professional and careful. She asked to confirm my identity. I calmly provided my full name and handed her the printed folder containing the physical ledgers, the forged loan documents, and the bank transaction records I had extracted from the warehouse safe. I told her my attorney David was already coordinating with the federal prosecutor's office downtown. Richard looked back at me one final time as the officers marched him toward the waiting police cruiser. His eyes were wide and bloodshot, silently pleading with me to fix it, expecting me to swoop in and clean up his massive mess, just like I had done with his sloppy business proposals and unpaid taxes for 18 years. I did not look away. I did not offer a single ounce of comfort. I simply watched them push his head down and guide him into the back seat of the police car. The heavy door slammed shut, severing him completely from the luxury life he had tried to steal from me. The fallout over the next 2 weeks was absolute and catastrophic. When a federal hard freeze drops onto a fraudulent corporate entity, it does not just pause the money, it suffocates the entire operation. Caldwell. Luxury landscapes collapsed practically overnight. Without access to the offshore operating accounts, the commercial equipment was immediately repossessed by the banks. The massive warehouse was seized and locked down as an active federal crime scene. The wealthy suburban clients, terrified of being associated with a federal investigation, immediately canceled their lucrative contracts. The local news stations ran a massive, damaging story about the prominent suburban businessman running an elaborate offshore tax evasion and wire fraud scheme. Richard's professional reputation in Boston was permanently annihilated, but the legal justice executed in the family courts was even sweeter. When we first got married, Richard had insisted on a very strict prenuptial agreement. He claimed it was just standard business practice to protect his future company assets from marital disputes. He wanted to ensure that if we ever divorced, I would walk away with absolutely nothing. He thought he was incredibly smart securing his empire while utilizing my free labor. But my ruthless divorce attorney, David, used that very same arrogance to destroy him. Because Richard had actively used our marital home and our joint corporate tax filings to commit federal felonies, he had fundamentally breached the core fiduciary clauses of his own ironclad prenuptial agreement. The family court judge did not even hesitate to rule in my favor. The prenuptial agreement was entirely voided. The judge awarded me sole unencumbered ownership of the house, liquidating the remaining clean corporate assets to pay off any legitimate vendor debts and fully securing my financial independence. I did not lose my home. I did not inherit his massive fraudulent loans. I was completely protected by the very laws he tried to manipulate. And then there was Chloe, the 25-year-old pregnant mistress, sitting in her downtown luxury penthouse, eagerly waiting for her rich fiancé to buy her a $3 million mountain house in Aspen. The federal asset freeze cut off the fraudulent corporate rent payments to her high-security building immediately. The luxury property managers, realizing the shell company funding the lease was under federal criminal investigation, served her with an aggressive emergency eviction notice. When she finally understood the terrifying reality of the situation, she completely panicked. Richard was not a wealthy, successful bachelor. He was a married bankrupt fraudster facing a massive federal prison sentence. He had absolutely zero assets, zero future, and zero ability to support her or their unborn child. She did not stand loyally by her man. She packed whatever expensive designer clothes she could fit into a single suitcase, abandoned the downtown penthouse, and moved straight back into her parents' small house in the distant suburbs. The beautiful, wealthy future Richard had promised her was nothing but a cruel mirage built entirely on my stolen money. When she realized the money was gone, her love for him vanished just as quickly. 3 weeks after the anniversary party, I sat in a sterile, brightly lit deposition room inside a federal building downtown. David sat to my right, organizing a thick stack of financial audits and property deeds. We were there to formally separate my legitimate personal finances from the criminal investigation of the landscaping company. The heavy wooden door opened and Richard walked in, accompanied by a tired-looking public defender. His expensive assets were entirely frozen, so he could no longer afford a shark private lawyer. He looked absolutely terrible. The tailored charcoal suits were gone, replaced by a cheap, wrinkled button-down shirt. He had lost significant weight, his skin was pale and sallow, and the arrogant, confident businessman I had known for nearly 2 decades had completely evaporated. He looked exactly like what he was, a desperate, ruined man facing the devastating consequences of his own hubris. He took a seat directly across the long mahogany table from me. For a long time, the only sound in the room was the quiet rustling of legal papers. The federal prosecutor stepped out for a moment to take a phone call, leaving the 4 of us alone in the quiet room. Richard looked up. His eyes were red, heavily bloodshot, and swimming with unshed tears. "Evelyn," he whispered, his voice cracking with heavy, manufactured emotion. "Please." I looked at him, feeling absolutely nothing. No anger, no sorrow, no lingering affection. Just a profound quiet and peaceful emptiness. "I am so incredibly sorry," he continued, leaning forward, pressing his trembling hands flat against the table. "I lost my way. I let the massive pressure of the business get to me. I made a terrible, unforgivable mistake. But we built this beautiful life together. You are my wife. I love you. Please, Evelyn, if you just talk to the prosecutor, if you just tell them I was confused about the tax codes, they might reduce the federal charges. I am looking at 10 years in federal prison. 10 years of my life gone. Please do not let them take my life away." He let a single pathetic tear roll slowly down his cheek. It was a masterful, calculated performance. It was the exact same vulnerable, desperate look he used to give me when we were in our 20s, begging me to take an extra exhausting shift at the bank so he could afford better equipment for his failing startup. He was trying to play the exact same emotional chord, desperately hoping the obedient, sacrificing wife was still hiding somewhere inside my chest, ready to absorb his pain. I sat perfectly still. I let him cry. I let him beg. I watched him desperately try to manipulate my empathy, relying on the love and devotion I had given him freely and blindly for 18 years. "You did not make a mistake, Richard," I said, my voice carrying the cold, clinical precision of a veteran auditor delivering a final, damning assessment. "A mistake is forgetting to file a quarterly tax extension. Forging my legal signature on an $850,000 loan document, funneling that stolen equity through a fake corporate vendor, and buying a luxury penthouse for your pregnant mistress is absolutely not a mistake. It is a highly calculated, deliberate, and malicious strategy to completely destroy my life for your personal gain." He swallowed hard, shaking his head frantically. "I panicked. I did not want to hurt you. I just wanted a fresh start." "You wanted me completely ruined," I corrected him smoothly, shutting down his pathetic excuses. "You told your sister you were going to leave me holding the bag for the massive corporate debt. You told Chloe you were going to let the predatory private lenders foreclose on the house I worked to pay for. You were going to let me sleep on the street so you could drink expensive champagne in the mountains." I reached into my leather purse sitting on the chair beside me. I did not pull out a tissue to dry his fake tears. I did not pull out a legal document. I reached into my wallet and pulled out a single crisp $1 bill. For 18 years, I said, keeping my eyes locked firmly on his pale, sweating face, I gave you absolutely everything I had. I abandoned my master's degree program. I worked 3 exhausting jobs. I built your entire accounting infrastructure. I managed your payroll, filed your taxes, and ruthlessly negotiated your commercial contracts. I sacrificed my youth, my career trajectory, and my financial independence so you could stand at the front of the room and pretend you were a brilliant self-made man. I was your ultimate investment. I placed the $1 bill on the polished mahogany table. I pressed my index finger against the paper and slowly, deliberately slid the dollar across the smooth surface until it stopped directly in front of his trembling hands. And this, Richard, I told him. My voice, completely devoid of any mercy or hesitation, is your absolute final return on that investment. He stared down at the single dollar bill resting on the table. His face crumpled into a mask of pure, absolute devastation. He finally realized that the woman he had underestimated, the woman he had treated like an invisible, unpaid appliance for 2 decades, had completely outplayed him. He had absolutely nothing left to leverage. The public defender awkwardly looked away, staring at the wall, refusing to meet my attorney's eyes. The federal prosecutor walked back into the room, closing the heavy wooden door behind him. We are ready to proceed with the asset separation, he announced, taking his seat at the head of the table. I leaned back in my chair, smoothing the fabric of my skirt. I did not look at Richard again for the remainder of the deposition. I answered the prosecutor's questions clearly, accurately, and without hesitation. I signed the heavy stack of documents finalizing my sole ownership of the remaining clean assets. When the long meeting was finally over, I stood up, shook the prosecutor's hand, and walked out of the room without a single backward glance at the weeping man I used to call my husband. I walked out of the federal building and stepped onto the busy downtown Boston sidewalk. The afternoon sun was shining brightly, reflecting beautifully off the towering glass skyscrapers. The crisp, clean autumn air filled my lungs. I took a deep, long breath. The massive, suffocating weight I had carried on my shoulders for 18 years was permanently gone. I had walked into that marriage as a brilliant, ambitious young woman, willing to shrink herself for love. I was walking out of it as a wealthy, independent, utterly victorious survivor who would never make herself small for anyone ever again. 6 months have passed since that cool autumn evening when the flashing police cruisers pulled into my driveway and carried my husband away in steel handcuffs. The immediate aftermath was a chaotic whirlwind of federal investigations, aggressive legal filings, and exhausting court dates. Because Richard had so recklessly tied his fraudulent offshore accounts to our legitimate commercial landscaping operations, the family court judge did not hesitate to drop a heavy gavel on his perfectly laid plans. The judge completely voided our ironclad prenuptial agreement, citing severe financial misconduct and federal fraud. I was awarded sole unencumbered ownership of Caldwell Luxury Landscapes. But I absolutely did not want to run the massive empire that my unpaid labor and stolen youth had built for a man who actively despised me. I wanted it completely gone. I wanted every single trace of Richard Caldwell liquidated, erased, and transformed into cold, hard, untethered capital. I spent the first 3 months conducting a brutal forensic cleansing of the company books. I fired his brother Todd, immediately personally handing his massive file of money laundering evidence over to the federal prosecutors. Then I put the entire commercial landscaping operation up for public sale. Because I had spent a decade ruthlessly managing the vendor contracts, building the elite client roster, and perfectly balancing the corporate ledgers, the business was incredibly profitable on paper once Richard's massive fraudulent expense drains were permanently removed. A massive commercial real estate conglomerate out of Chicago bought the company for a staggering profit. The day the final sale funds cleared my private, heavily secured banking account, I sat alone in my quiet kitchen, looking at the massive digital balance glowing on my screen. It was millions. It was the exact calculated monetary value of my 18 years of profound sacrifice, finally returned to its rightful owner. I poured myself a glass of expensive imported champagne, the exact kind Richard used to save only for his wealthy clients, and drank it in absolute silence. The house was mine. The money was mine. The air in my lungs finally belonged entirely to me. When the federal authorities finally finished dismantling Caldwell Luxury Landscapes, the sheer scope of Richard's criminal negligence was laid bare for the courts to see. It took months for the federal forensic accountants to track down every single dollar he had attempted to launder through fake vendor invoices and offshore holding trusts. During that exhausting legal process, I was forced to sit in sterile deposition rooms and review 18 years of my own forged signatures. I had to look at banking documents dating back a decade where my name had been meticulously copied to authorize massive credit lines I never knew existed. Seeing the physical paper evidence of his long-term deception was a brutal, visceral shock. It proved beyond a shadow of a doubt that his ultimate betrayal was not a sudden moment of panic or a momentary lapse in judgment. It was a highly calculated, sustained campaign of severe financial abuse that spanned the entire duration of our marriage. But I did not just want to sit in a big empty house and count my settlement money. The seasoned, brilliant financial analyst inside me had been fully awakened, and she was hungry for a brand new purpose. I realized that my devastating story was not an isolated tragedy. There were thousands of women out there, women in their 40s, 50s, and 60s, who had spent their entire adult lives acting as the invisible, unpaid engines behind their husbands' massive successes. Women who obediently signed joint tax returns without reading the fine print because they completely trusted the men sitting across the dinner table. Women who were one forged signature away from absolute terrifying financial ruin. Using the massive capital from the sale of the landscaping business, I leased a beautiful sunlit corner office in downtown Boston. I opened my own boutique financial consulting firm. I did not focus on traditional corporate wealth management or standard commercial mergers. I specialized in domestic financial auditing. I started helping women aggressively audit their own marriages and family businesses. I became the exact person I had desperately needed 18 years ago. That is why I named my new firm Caldwell Vanguard. I took the name my husband had actively tried to destroy and turned it into an impenetrable fortress. Today, my firm employs a dedicated team of 6 brilliant female financial analysts. We work directly with top-tier divorce attorneys across the state of Massachusetts. We act as the rapid response team for women who suspect their husbands are secretly hiding assets. We trace encrypted digital wallets, we audit massive shell companies disguised as local consulting firms, and we relentlessly subpoena offshore banking records. We leave absolutely no stone unturned. We rip the expensive masks off the charming, charismatic businessmen who think they can easily outsmart the loyal women they married. Walking into my own office on the first day of operation was a profoundly emotional experience. There was no heavy mahogany desk purchased specifically to make an insecure man feel important. There were no hidden fireproof safes or secret burner phones. Just clean glass, bright natural light, and absolute financial transparency. My very first client was a gentle woman in her late 50s named Barbara. She had spent 30 exhausting years running the back office of her husband's massive construction firm, only to discover he was quietly funneling corporate profits into a hidden investment account to fund a secret life overseas. I sat with Barbara for 3 intense weeks, tracing every single digital transaction, unraveling the complicated web of deceit until we had an airtight, devastating legal case. Watching Barbara stand up in federal court, fully armed with the undeniable financial truth I had helped her secure, brought me a level of deep, resonant satisfaction that no amount of settlement money could ever buy. Watching these arrogant men squirm in court when we present the heavy binders of undeniable financial proof is a feeling I will simply never grow tired of. They always walk into the courtroom with the exact same smug smirk Richard wore on the night of our anniversary party. They genuinely believe that because their wives spent decades managing the household and raising the children, they are somehow fundamentally incapable of understanding complex corporate ledgers. They severely underestimate the terrifying laser focus of a woman who has finally realized she is being robbed. I was not just catching financial criminals. I was giving wonderful women their stolen lives back. I was handing them the sharp sword and the heavy shield they desperately needed to reclaim their own futures. In the quiet moments between client meetings, I often find myself deeply reflecting on the 18 years I spent making myself incredibly small. I think about the brilliant young woman I was in my early 20s, the girl who voluntarily walked away from a prestigious master program and a full-ride academic scholarship because a charismatic man convinced her that his towering dreams were far more important than her own. I remember the sheer bone-deep exhaustion of working 3 low-paying jobs just to buy his very first commercial lawnmower. I remember the absolute humiliation of wearing cheap clearance rack shoes with worn-out soles so he could walk into luxury boardrooms wearing tailored designer suits. I did all of it willingly. I did it because society had taught me a very dangerous, highly insidious lie. I had been taught that true love was completely synonymous with endless, unquestioning sacrifice. I believed that being a good, loyal wife meant being a quiet, accommodating martyr. I believed that if I just worked hard enough, supported him long enough, and demanded little enough for myself, I would eventually be rewarded with permanent safety and emotional security. But financial abuse does not typically announce itself with a dangerous weapon or a raised voice. It hides brilliantly behind the comfortable, socially accepted guise of traditional marital duty. It thrives in the dark, quiet corners of shared bank accounts and complicated joint tax returns. Richard used my absolute devotion as a convenient blindfold. He weaponized my unwavering trust to strip the massive equity out of the very home I had bled myself dry to finally pay off. The most devastating realization of my entire ordeal was not that he had a pregnant mistress waiting for him in a downtown luxury penthouse. The young mistress was just a predictable symptom of the disease. The true unforgivable betrayal was his absolute staggering entitlement to my life. He actually believed he had the fundamental right to consume my youth, exhaust my intellect, and then leave me completely homeless and bankrupt the exact moment I was no longer a convenient financial asset. He thought he could easily steal my perfect credit score and my future to fund a new wealthy life with a younger woman, because he genuinely believed my entire existence was designed solely to serve his ambitions. I learned the absolute hardest lesson a woman can ever learn. Love shouldn't cost you your identity, and it certainly shouldn't cost you your credit score. True partnership is built on absolute financial transparency and deep mutual respect, not on silent servitude. You cannot purchase loyalty with unpaid labor. You cannot secure a man's heart by making yourself a convenient financial stepping stone for him to crush under his heavy work boots. When you actively abandon your own ambitions to build a massive empire with your name entirely left off the deed, you are not building a secure marriage. You are building your own prison. Every single week, new women walk through the heavy glass doors of my consulting firm. They come from wealthy manicured suburbs, from modest rural towns, and from towering city apartments. They sit in the comfortable chairs directly across from my desk, clutching their purses with white knuckles, their eyes wide with the exact same terrifying realization I had when I unlocked Richard's laptop in the dark. They tell me harrowing stories that echo my own with chilling accuracy. A husband who suddenly insists on handling all the incoming household mail. A joint savings account that mysteriously drops in value due to unexplained market fluctuations. A sudden aggressive rush to refinance a perfectly good mortgage under the guise of funding a brand new business venture. I listen to them carefully. I do not offer empty platitudes or generic useless sympathy. I offer them immense power. I show them exactly how to request their own comprehensive credit reports, how to track digital footprints through complicated tax schedules, and how to firmly demand hard copies of every single document carrying their legal signature. I teach them that asking to see the bank statements is not an accusation of infidelity, it is a fundamental, non-negotiable right of an equal financial partnership. The intense resistance these brave women face at home is staggering. When they start asking questions, their husbands almost always respond with explosive indignation. They use the exact same manipulative tactics Richard used on me. They call their wives crazy and paranoid. They accuse them of destroying the marital trust. They act deeply wounded, desperately trying to shift the blame to the woman who is simply asking to understand her own financial reality. I tell my clients exactly what my own ruthless divorce attorney told me on that cold morning in his office. If your husband ever reacts to a simple request for financial transparency with extreme anger or defensive manipulation, he is absolutely not protecting his privacy. He is aggressively protecting his secrets. A truly honest man has absolutely nothing to fear from an open, highly visible ledger. It has been incredibly healing to constantly surround myself with the fierce, resilient energy of women waking up to their own immense worth. Sometimes after a long, exhausting day of untangling complex corporate frauds for my grateful clients, I walk down to the Boston waterfront and watch the large boats moving slowly across the dark harbor. The cold sea breeze hits my face, and I feel a profound, sweeping sense of absolute gratitude. The 18 years I spent trapped in the dark shadows of Caldwell luxury landscapes were not completely wasted. Every fake vendor invoice I blindly filed, every late night I spent perfectly balancing his heavy books, every cruel manipulation I silently endured, it was all a brutal, extensive training ground. The universe was slowly forging me into a highly specialized weapon perfectly designed to dismantle men exactly like Richard. My personal life has blossomed in beautiful ways I never thought possible when I was suffocating under the heavy weight of my marriage. I sold the massive suburban house with the sweeping driveway and the ancient oak trees. It was a beautiful property, but to me, it was an active crime scene. It held entirely too many memories of Richard smiling warmly at me across the dinner table, while actively plotting my complete ruin. I used a portion of the clean funds to purchase a stunning modern condominium overlooking the beautiful city skyline. It is not a penthouse funded by stolen equity and lies. It is a warm home purchased cleanly, legally, and proudly under my own name. I decorated it exactly how I wanted. No heavy mahogany furniture, no bitter compromises, just bright open spaces filled with the beautiful art and books I genuinely love. For the first time in my adult life, I am not frantically rushing home to cook a perfect hot dinner for a man who doesn't appreciate a single bite of it. I'm not spending my precious weekends doing unpaid corporate accounting to save a failing landscaping business. I travel exactly when I want to. I take long, quiet walks through the historic districts of Boston. I regularly reconnect with old friends from my college days, the brilliant, funny women I had pushed away because Richard found them too intimidating or too loud. I have fully reclaimed the vibrant, highly ambitious Evelyn Caldwell that I foolishly abandoned when I was 20 years old. And what about Richard? He is currently serving a lengthy mandatory sentence in a federal correctional facility. The federal fraud unit did not offer him a lenient plea deal. The physical evidence of massive wire fraud, severe corporate tax evasion, and forged bank documents actively crossing state lines was entirely insurmountable. His sister Sarah, who had laughed on that cheap burner phone about my impending homelessness, is currently drowning in massive legal debt, fighting desperately to keep her own home after her active complicity in the scheme was exposed to the authorities. Todd, the brother who happily took a 10% cut of my stolen equity while mocking my intelligence, is facing his own severe federal legal consequences. The entire toxic family structure completely collapsed under the crushing, undeniable weight of their own arrogance and greed. I do not dwell on their misery. I do not spend my days gloating over their complete destruction. The opposite of love is not hate. The opposite of love is absolute, unbothered indifference. They are simply ghosts from a past life, pathetic cautionary tales of what happens when massive arrogance and cruelty completely blind you to the quiet, calculating intelligence of the people you constantly underestimate. I share my story today not to seek your pity, but to sound a massive ringing alarm. We are raised in a culture that heavily glorifies the long-suffering wife. We are actively conditioned to applaud the loyal women who stand quietly by their men, constantly sacrificing their own dreams, their own financial security, and their own identities to keep the peace in the home. But peace built entirely on your own destruction is just a quiet, invisible war. When we allow ourselves to be completely financially dependent, we actively surrender our ultimate escape hatch. We give another human being the terrifying power to heavily dictate our reality, our safety, and our basic survival. I survived his master plan only because I was the one handling the corporate books. I survived because I still knew exactly how to read a raw ledger, how to spot a fake shell company, and how to track a fraudulent offshore wire transfer. If Richard had entirely controlled the corporate accounting, if I had simply been a housewife completely disconnected from the financial machinery of our lives, his terrible plan would have worked flawlessly. I would have been completely blindsided by the bank foreclosure notices. I would have been standing on the cold sidewalk with a single suitcase while he toasted his new wealthy life in Aspen. The terrifying knowledge that I narrowly escaped complete financial annihilation is a cold fire that burns in my chest every single day. It heavily fuels my passionate work at the consulting firm. It drives me to meticulously tear apart the hidden financial records of every single predatory husband who sits across from my clients in a mediation room. I have made it my ultimate life's mission to ensure that no loyal woman who comes to me for help will ever be left holding the bag for a coward's carefully hidden crimes. To every single woman listening to my voice right now, I desperately need you to understand that financial vigilance is not a dirty word. Auditing your own life is not a betrayal of your sacred marriage vows. It is a completely necessary act of profound self-preservation. You must know exactly where the money goes. You must firmly know what legal documents bear your signature. You must completely understand the health of your joint accounts, the strict terms of your mortgages, and the actual names registered to your massive investment portfolios. You absolutely cannot afford to be a passive passenger in the vehicle of your own financial future. You must have your hands firmly placed on the steering wheel. If you're watching this and you've ever put your own dreams on hold to build someone else's empire, I want you to look closely at whose name is on the deed. Trust but verify. Have you ever discovered a financial secret in a relationship? How did you handle it? Drop a comment below and don't forget to tell me what city you're watching from. If my story gave you the courage to look at your own books, hit that like button and subscribe for more stories of justice. You deserve a life that is entirely your own.